Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to our second day of the EQC meeting. Today we are getting underway with a review of the minutes, and we will also show that for the record, Vice Chair Barrasso cannot be with us here today, and Commissioner Addington has been with us. He has had to temporarily step away, but for the context of today's meeting, he is virtually present and will be returning to us shortly. Commissioners, we've all had an opportunity to review the minutes. Has anybody noted any need to amend the minutes as presented? Hearing none, I would entertain a motion to approve the minutes as presented. A motion to approve. I second. Motions have been made and seconded. Any further discussion? Hearing none, we will go ahead and take the vote because, as we said, as planned, Commissioner Addington is temporarily stepped away. I will need to vote so that we have a majority of active votes for this action item. So all those in favor of approving the minutes, please signify by saying aye. 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 Any opposed? Hearing none, the motion passes. So our next informational item is the commissioner reports. So this is a time where we just share any items or meetings that we've had as commissioners that may pertain or be relevant to our work here with DEQ. Does anyone have anything they'd like to share?
Go ahead.
Commissioner Slusher.
Thank you, Chair George. So I just wanted to give an update on some things that have been happening that involve the Board of Forestry, but specifically a draft environmental impact statement that was just issued for the draft habitat conservation plan for Western Oregon State Forests. So ODF, Oregon Department of Forestry, prepared a draft habitat conservation plan for Western Oregon State Forests. These are forests that are managed by the state, owned by the state, managed by the state. And the purpose of the HCP is to support applications for incidental take permits from National Marine Fisheries Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service for a variety of species that are listed under the Endangered Species Act. The proposed issuance of an incidental take permit is a federal action under NEPA, so an EIS is required. So NOAA Fisheries issued a draft EIS in March to evaluate potential environmental impacts from the issuance of the incidental take permits for ODF's legal forest management activities. So the EIS looks at the proposed action itself, which is to issue an incidental take permit with a permit term of 70 years and approve the habitat conservation plan. And then the no action alternative that was looked at is to apply current forest management practices under existing take avoidance policies. And just some overarching comparisons between the no action alternative and the proposed action, which is the incidental take permit. So the proposed action would have higher harvest levels than the no action alternative. But the proposed action would also have more monitoring and adaptive management requirements. But the reason this is relevant, I think, to the commission is that they did identify that the proposed action would have some potentially additional water quality impacts. So because of the increase in harvest, the draft EIS anticipated that the proposed action incidental take permit would result in greater potential adverse impacts on streams. But they also anticipate that expanded riparian buffers would help to minimize adverse impacts. They also determined that increased road construction would result in greater potential adverse impacts on streams, but that increased riparian equipment restriction zones would help mitigate those impacts. So just something I wanted to raise because it is, I think, relevant that this incidental take permit could result in adverse water quality impacts in Western state forests.
Absolutely. So my question is, So especially for those watersheds where we may have had TMDLs developed and we are supposed to be at an implementation phase, how does that work? How does the responsibilities of DMAs to implement more protective forestry and road building practices, how does that interact with an overarching plan like this?
So, Chair George, maybe I'll start, and Jennifer, please feel free. Just for awareness and partly because Commissioner Schlester's new, I'm on the steering committee for Oregon Department of Forestry's Habitat Conservation Plan application. And so we've been, there's several state agencies participating and federal agencies participating in that work of the steering committee. There's also what's called a scoping team that is more at the staff technical level that's working together. And we have DEQ, a DEQ staff person on that team as well. And at both of those levels, more at the scoping team, staff level, but also the steering committee, those conversations are happening precisely about what does that mean for TMDLs and for DMAs. One reminder, we're just talking about state-owned forest lands. So this is not the private forest lands that have been under discussion under the private forest accords. But broadly, I think a lot of the role of our staff has been to try and see where TMDL compliance could be achieved with the proposed habitat conservation plan. There are different series of stream buffers that are proposed, which you probably heard about some, Commissioner Schlesser, in terms of fish-bearing streams and non-fish-bearing streams. And so the goal is that there could be TMDL compliance. However, it is not presumed that automatically all of the buffers and the mitigation strategies would result in TMDL compliance. DMAs would still need to assure that TMDL compliance is achieved in those areas. So it's another consideration that they would have in their practices. They also have annual plans. So the HCP is more of the broad overarching 70-year permit from the federal services. ODF then still has to have their annual plans for where they're harvesting and which strategies are they using, and that's where some of those compliance efforts really come into play, is in those annual plans. Jennifer, did I miss anything or?
Good morning, Jennifer Weigel. I'm the Water Quality Administrator. One thing I'll add to Leo's remarks is, so with that whole process, Commissioner Schlesser, as you recognize, it is a process that's focused on what elements would be necessary for a habitat conservation plan for threatened and endangered species. So there are important pollutant parameters that cross over into our Clean Water Act responsibilities, but it is not exhaustive. And so as Leah mentioned, there's been a lot of work to, as we go through that process, to understand where we get benefits for both water quality and fish. And of course, an important component for the fish is the water quality. But there are above and beyond water quality needs beyond the specific fish species being considered under this. So we recognize there's a great opportunity and benefit to both meet ESA obligations and Clean Water Act obligations. But the purpose of this project is not to satisfy Clean Water Act obligations. So we have separate conversations and processes where there are additional water quality needs that we identify that would go above and beyond the habitat conservation plan or the incidental take permit as well. And some of those opportunities are the annual plans, working through our various processes with ODF around implementation of TMDL. So that all exists in addition to the benefits that could be coming from this process that we would be hopeful and based on our work and understanding of this process today would be significant in terms of protections that this process would provide for both fish and water quality. So.
If I may ask a question, so acknowledged that This is a habitat conservation plan, it's not a clean water plan, but as you say, there should be complementary benefits. Also acknowledge this is the state lands plan, it's not private forest land. But it would seem to me that if ever there was a time that the state of Oregon could say that for those areas where we have TMDLs and we're supposed to be implementing them, where our goal is going to be to implement them, where they're complementary to this plan. Why? It sounds to me like there's a lot of very careful talking. Well, maybe we will, maybe we won't implement the TMDLs. We have to consider other things. If this is a state plan on state lands and the state has told the Department of Environmental Quality, this is the things you're supposed to do. Why wouldn't our open and stated goal be that to the extent that it's complementary to the recovery of listed species, we're going to implement TMDLs? Isn't this the place where the state would have almost maximized control and authority to direct agencies to work together to make that happen? I guess I'm just coming from a place where, you know, as one Oregonian, I struggle with why it's taken so long to implement TMDLs. And it seems to me that this is a laboratory in which, if ever, the state has the ability to try to say to the maximum extent possible, we're going to make this happen. And maybe I just was picking up on the wrong things, but it didn't sound like I was hearing something close to that.
Chair George, if I could. One of the complicated pieces of this, because and those questions are absolutely relevant and appropriate questions to ask. So I'm going to start there because I think those are the kinds of conversations we have as well. So just to acknowledge that the piece and the draft environmental impact statement come from the federal fisheries agencies. And so this comes from their perspective around the listed fish species. And and also in this case, I believe there are additional terrestrial species that are being considered under this habitat conservation plan. I think from DEQ's perspective, through that process that really ultimately is the permitting agency or the permitted agency, whoever would be issued incidental take permit, developing a draft HCP, and then the federal fisheries agencies who consider that and develop the environmental impact statement. We would love for that process to explicitly incorporate Clean Water Act pieces. I mean, I think that would be optimal. Unfortunately, I don't think that process is set up in a way because of how it's administered for us. I think what we try to do is think about how can, as much as we can along the way, identify those opportunities to connect the two. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, you know, you're going to hear more about this morning in your first agenda item. We try as much as possible to be able to connect with the federal fisheries agencies and the work that we're doing to try to ensure that these things triangulate. Unfortunately, and I think sometimes to our frustration, the way in which the federal fisheries agency and some of those processes that have to do with habitat conservation plans and the way that federal fisheries agencies engage with us on Clean Water Act actions is not a seamless process either. So I think there's some inherent tensions between how HCP processes are set up and how our Clean Water Act processes are set up that make it difficult to knit that together in a way that gives us that ultimate solution. I think we try to influence those processes and understand as we go along, and that's why we've got folks participating in this HCP process, but it's very challenging to have that be a seamless way to go in terms of just how they're administered.
Okay, well, you're right, not unlike yesterday. We're probably going to get a fair amount of that in our next agenda item, but Director, did you have anything else you wanted to say?
Well, only stepping aside from all the process part of this, you know, what I hear from our staff is that the practices being proposed as part of the habitat conservation plan are generally consistent with what Oregon DEQ will want to see in TMDL implementation. So without saying that there's perfect alignment there may be specific situations where more is required, but in general, at a high level, the practices that are part of those plans are consistent with what we know now about a likely TMDL implementation. And part of it, there's also a timing issue here because, of course, sorry, I'm going to take you on a little bit of a loop here, but under your in the past, it has typically been presumed that compliance with Oregon Forest Practice Act regulations is sufficient for TMDL implementation. That's really with the new MOA with forestry and with the work that we're doing on TMDLs and with the private forest accords changing that baseline of what the forest practice rules are. There are a lot of moving parts here. And so looking at sufficient, we're not at the stage where we're determining sufficiency right now. We will be as we work on the temperature TMDLs, doing that. And as part of that, we'll also be looking at things like for state lands, the habitat conservation lands, and making a determination about whether they're enough or not. So there's a sequencing issue here also. But I think in the future, as we get these TMDLs in place, we'll be in a better position as these sorts of planning processes are done to review against a TMDL that's in place. But right now, the TMDL is kind of in flux with the history and with the work that's currently going on the temperature. So
Okay.
I'm sorry, I hope that may have confused things further, but I think that the takeaway is that at a high level and this isn't a formal determination, but staff are generally saying that the practices in the proposed ACP are consistent with the types of things we're going to see.
Okay, well, thank you. And maybe I took us a little further on that one than I should have. So with that, Commissioner Slusher, do you have anything else that you'd like to update the group about?
No, that's it.
Okay. Commissioner Cobb?
Yeah, so I'm happy to share that the OM meeting met on April 26th and 27th, at which point I did announce that Greg will be taking my place. So I was a little proactive there. Soon the paperwork will follow. And I think I'm going to have to actually keep logging into their meetings because one of the things that I enjoy the most that I've shared before is the success stories that they always share. And so since a lot of this meeting is always a little on the doony and goony side, I thought I would start us off with saying about the Crooked River Watershed Opal Spring project that they highlighted, and you can go to the website and see it. It is a project that put a fish ladder over a dam that was completely impacted. And it's done. So they finally kind of gave a little show and tell, and there's a video slideshow kind of on the OWIB website if you want to see it. But it was completed in 2019 on November 19th. And the first steelhead that cruised through the little passage was November 20th. And since then it has actually been used, and they've got 3 years of usage data showing that a lot of the salmonids, including the Chinooks and the sockeyes and steelheads, are now using that stretch of the river that they previously were denied. So that is fun. There is fluctuations that they kind of explain. It's only 3 years of data, so it's hard to draw a straight line through it. But there was a drought year in there. They kind of explain some of the stuff. But that was really fun to see, and you can see the construction and everything else and the care that they took when they were setting up those inflatable dams as they kind of had to work their way across the river. So if you have the engineering bent of like, well, how do you keep separate? How? There's a handy dandy list. That's really interesting. The other good news to kind of share out of the OWEB meeting was that they had a really good special session as well. And there were monies, new monies for drought relief that was focused kind of in Clackamas and Jackson County that are around irrigation district modernization plans, which I think would dovetail in with some of those water quality and possibly kind of keep more water in streams. And then also, there was 5 million in the areas that were affected by the fires for kind of specific relief programs. OWEB being pretty nimble on the grant writing fund, they already have 4 of the grant programs up and running. They're kind of around the riparian and upland replanting, flood restoration, and kind of 2 others that I can't remember. But it's really nice to see how quickly that agency can mobilize money. It is by pulling and using staff differently, so I don't know how sustainable it is, but it's nimble and quick. And then the other thing that I thought would be useful to know about is we did start kind of a new grant award program within their portfolio that was for their focused investment programs or their FIPs. And it's the FIP Effectiveness Monitoring Award. And it was the idea that previously all of the grants did have some monitoring, but it was for like the lifespan of the initial project. There was nothing that would kind of tell you how it worked in the long, like what were the results after 5 years, 10 years kind of thing. And so we passed that and we made the first award. And the first award is going to the Ashland Forest All Lands Restoration, which is a fire, I don't know the right way to say that, fire restoration project where they're using controlled burns. So that's going to give us data from kind of 2016 up through 2023 to see how the impacts of that are. And considering how frequently that area kind of burns, and also what are the long-term impacts on kind of that restoration fire usage. I think there's going to be some really interesting information that comes out of that over kind of the next 5 years that can be used broadly, that'll be relevant to the state as conversations continue to evolve around using fire as a management tool within all of this stuff. So I think that's a really kind of exciting monitoring program. It's an interesting one to do through OWEB because they are somewhat constrained by their statute. They can't do research, and this could very well be kind of a research project. But it is this idea of trying to gather long-term monitoring so that they have information for adaptive management moving forward. So I thought those were all actually really cool. And then the rest of it was just typical OWEB business. But such a good group. It is so much fun. They're the nicest people.
Thank you, Commissioner. And I'll say I have been in communication with Lisa Hanson, the OWEB director, and with Commissioner Addington, who I do not believe is on.
He is.
He is, okay. So the next OWEB meeting is in July, and that's
July 26th and 27th. You're up, Greg.
That's the transition to Commissioner Addington. And we'll get the paperwork done here in the coming weeks.
Well, I don't know where we're at in the agenda, and I apologize for being away. I just wanted to add on the tail end of that I went back to try to prepare myself a little bit and watch the recording of the last OWEB meeting, most of it. I just would like to note that Commissioner Kyle obviously has made a big impression on that group. They were really, really complimentary of her time and work with the OWEB. So big shoes to fill, but great job, Molly.
Thank you.
Thank
You're
you.
gonna love it, Greg. It's actually, it's bittersweet to give it up.
Well, thank you both very much. Thank you very much, Commissioner Kyle, for your long and I'm sure talented service on that committee. But it sounds like, Greg, you get to go to a good group that's doing good work. So we're also very thankful for your willingness to do that. We're on commissioner reports. So if there's anything else you'd like to share, now would be a great time about just, things you may have been up to that may inform our work here together.
Thank you. And not really, I will note that the next OWEB meeting is in Wallowa County, and that is awesome. So I'm looking forward to that. It is a very long drive. Let's see, I guess the only thing is, and I've brought this up last time, and Richard, I think I've talked to you about it. Sometimes I don't know, I guess if I'm asking for something that's not appropriate, somebody will tell me. Sometimes I don't know the rule makings that are happening, and I'm trying to pay a little more attention to that and be careful about stuff. But I am really interested in what is happening with not just the Port of Moro, but that whole region there with the groundwater. And I mean, I obviously in my course of my work, I talk to different people, and one of the things that and I brought it up yesterday, and I just wonder about the communication from DEQ to some of the regulated community. I understand that DEQ's job is to regulate, and so that brings with it its own set of protocols and issues and needing to be careful about probably certain things that could be appealed or whatnot. But I also think that when I talk to you guys, I think that communication is important with everyone. And I just feel like there's a little bit of a disconnect between some of those parties and what I hear from you all. And so I guess my question or request is this something that we could have an informational hearing on for the commission about just everything that's going on out there and what the status of things are? Or is that, like I said, is that the timing inappropriate right now?
Yeah.
Oh, please.
Yeah. So thank you, Commissioner Addington. I am going to talk about Port of Moro and Lower Umatilla groundwater management area as part of the director's report. I can do it a little bit now and give you a little bit of a preview, but we, at the same time, we are in regulatory processes specifically with the Port of Moro and at least one other facility out there that are in either an active enforcement matter or a permit modification. So I do need to be a little bit careful. And we need to be a little bit careful about not creating procedural problems where we've got a record and a comment period and things like that that may have closed. But at a high level, what I'll say is to assure you that this is my opinion, I think we've gone above and beyond in terms of communication with all of the interest in that area, including the regulated entities, local officials, members of the agricultural community, environmental interest who are interested in the situation. And I'm probably leaving some out, but we have gone above and beyond on communication around the Port of Moro. And in fact, we're somewhat ironically getting criticized for communicating as much as we have in the media. So we want to make sure as we work through the issues, the real issues around water quality, that we understand the facts on the ground and that we understand everybody's perspectives on what practical solutions are to the problems we're trying to address. And I think we're doing a good job on that. It's controversial. Not everybody's coming at this from the same position. And there are strong feelings because of the amount of time that this situation has been going on for now 30 plus years, and the potential consequences in terms of very important major employers in the area, but also public health. And so I will talk about it a little bit more substantively in the director's report, but I think from a communications perspective, we're spending a lot of time and a lot of effort communicating, in some ways over communicating with everybody about the situation out there. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think because of what I said about the stakes being high and also us needing to understand the practicalities of how do we solve the problem, it is important for us to talk to people, and we're doing that. We're doing a lot of that.
Well, thank you, Richard. I appreciate that. And I guess I maybe should have been more specific. I'm interested in, I mean, I know there's a problem, and I think there's a recognition of there's a problem. I'm interested in the communication about what are the practical solutions moving forward. And I think people out there have some ideas, and the impression I get is that they're having trouble conveying or having those conversations with DEQ. That's not what I'm hearing from you. So that's why I bring it up, is it just seems like there's something's off somewhere, but I'm interested in the moving forward part.
So are we, and very much so. And I actually, I'm thinking about what Commissioner Kyle said about EQC meetings being doom and gloom meetings. I actually think this is a good news story in a way that probably not everybody will appreciate. But the reality is we've been kind of stuck on Lower Umatilla for 30 years now, and now everybody's coming to the table to actually fix the problems. And I think that is a good news story. And it's to the credit of everybody involved, including not just the ag community in Puerto Moro, but local public health officials, our congressional delegation, a lot of people really coming to the table to say, we got to fix this problem. Let's figure it out.
Thank you. Chair George, I took way too much time, so I'll be done.
No worries. That sounded like an important point to me, so thank you for it. I'll try to finish up rather quickly. I think I'm only going to mention two things. I think I've shared before that I'm participating in this legislatively directed, state-supported regional water planning, legislative work group, and that's a mouthful. And so are the meetings. This is a challenging group, and I've mentioned it before. And everybody in there, of course, rightly so, has their very own perspectives. I think it's also particularly challenging because we're being asked to provide some advice around these specific regional water planning and potentially solution creating efforts. And certainly some have occurred in various parts of the state, and it sounds like some good things have come out of those. I think it's also challenging, though, to be asked to just speak to these occasionally occurring region-specific planning efforts when it's kind of hard to do that in the absence of people have so many questions about, well, what is the larger backdrop? What are we saying as a state more largely about our water policy and how the issues from quantity to quality to habitat to developing communities and working land. When we have so many questions about the surround, I think everybody's really struggling to kind of make isolated advice about regional projects because they might be good, but again, you also have to have some critical reason that people choose to come to the table in that region. And what is that? And the examples we've looked at, there's always a reason, right? And so I just think we'll do our best. It'll be interesting to see what, if anything, comes out of this. And I think it's fine. I get from the legislature's perspective why they would want to ask. If we're going to continue to put in for money towards these regional projects, we want the citizens to tell us it's worth doing that. I certainly understand from their perspective why they want somebody to answer that question for them. But I think it's a really difficult challenge when the group, like I said, is kind of going, so what's the benefit of these one-off regional projects when really so many people have so many larger policy questions about our larger kind of underlying policy issues around water in the state. So anyhow, it would be very interesting to see how that continues. We're going to try to do an in-person meeting coming up, and maybe that'll make everything clear. So we'll hold out hope for that. I and the tribes participating in the process were asked to give some perspectives around how tribes come to this conversation, which I think was very interesting and unique question, and really relevant, right? It's interesting to note because so many other components, people and interests who are at this table have had opportunities to say how they come to this issue and why they need the water for their uses. But it was kind of very interesting and educational, I think, to let people know, well, you know, hey, as tribes come to the table today, we're kind of in a uniquely and intentionally disadvantaged position, right? So when the most valuable water rights were being given away, most of the tribes in this state had been terminated by the federal government, and by intention, by design, had no legal identity by which to own land or water or anything else. And so, and then the couple of tribes who were not, were certainly not in any sort of empowered government status at the time. So while they may not have been terminated, they were in very desperate straits and not able, for the most part, to participate in those conversations. So and that is, again, we can't say that's an accident of history. It's not. It's an intention of history. We're in a different place today. So tribes, like all other communities, come to the table with their own complex water needs, but by design, they didn't have the opportunity to play when the getting was good. And there are things like Indian Reserve water rights, but I said if anybody's worried about that, don't be in the context of this planning process. Try it sometime. Talk to the Klamath. It took over 40 years to get their water rights settled. So absolutely nothing will happen in that context in any sort of time frame anyone in this process is talking about. So while it may be relevant, it's not in the field of play here at all. So don't be concerned about that, at least affecting this work. So anyhow, it'll be interesting to see if anything that comes out of that is helpful to the water-related work that DEQ does. The only other thing I'll mention is I was invited as an elected tribal leader to participate in tribal consultation with the Council of Environmental Quality, consultation around their beta version of a model about what they're calling the climate and economic justice model. And so this is a screening tool. It has some things, I think, some kind of goals in common with some of the screening tools and models we've talked about here at DEQ. It also has some very real and I think significant differences. In the limited amount of time I was able to look at this tool and also sharing a little bit of information with our friends here, one of my major concerns is, at least at the beta version, despite the fact that they call it a climate and economic justice screening tool, they are not identifying any communities, significant communities of color, known communities who suffer disproportionate environmental and health impacts or environmentally based health impacts. And we have an expert on this right here. This isn't hypothetical, this is real, it's studied. People can say a great deal about it. But strangely, the CEQ model, kind of took one of these ideas that, well, we want everybody to have, good environmental health. I said, yes, so that's why you better not ignore the people who are disproportionately impacted. So I tried to make that comment loud and strong. And then the other thing I'd let my state partners know is that there were no tribal lands or different tribal populations, which would make sense with my previous conversation, but even jurisdictional reservation lands weren't present on the map. And so again, after all the introductory comments about how important it is to consult with tribes, we said, well, how will you know if you're impacting tribal communities or lands if you don't have them on your map? And again, they said, well, we didn't want to presume that we should put them on there. And I said, okay, well, as one tribe, I'm telling you, we think you should put them on there. And interestingly, so while others were talking, I just tried to scroll through on the map to look at my own reservation. And interestingly, because they're using census tracts to identify the different population blocks, they had identified that there was a tribal population in the census tract north of the community of Groundwater. But the census tract that our village, our community actually sits in was not identified as having any significant tribal population because that larger census tract is made up of more white people. So, despite the fact that more Indian people live there than anywhere for hundreds of miles around, it doesn't show up at all because the larger tract has people from West Salem in it. So again, I would just express, if you have an opportunity to talk to them about this model and how it does or doesn't work for the goals of environmental justice, I think we have to call out some really fundamental challenges with the way that they. That's what I would share, and thank you.
So just to kind of dovetail on that comment
Yes,
about
please.
erasure by census block, it's a well-known public health kind of criteria. There are now new models trying to look at ways to create a mathematical kind of formula that avoids that type of censure. So it might be something to look into, whether it's applied here in Oregon, but it is something that's been common discussed.
So if I could, Chair George and Commissioner Kyle, geography matters, scale matters, and a lot of the reasons that racial justice has been invisible to people generally, but government in particular, is when we look at things at a state level, or we look at things at a county level, or we look at things even at a census tract level. The scales are so big that those disproportionate impacts disappear, as you just so eloquently described. So as we are building new tools to look at these issues, getting the scale right so that we are actually able to see what those impacts are is so important. And at the same time, are the data, so there's the scale, and then there's the data collection. Do we collect data at a geographic scale that allows us to see that picture as well? So we are in the thick of that discussion and work now, and that will be, I think, going on for many years here. But it is so important that I see this issue popping up across the media, whether it's a water issue or an air issue or a contaminated land issue. The issue of scale and scale of data is really, really important. I'll talk a little bit more about this in the director's report, talking about the work that's going on environmental justice, but it's very clear that while the Biden-Harris administration is trying at the national level to make some progress on this, different parts of the country are in very different places on these issues. And so there is an opportunity in a state like Oregon, in some other states on the West Coast, to really lead in this work. And I'm going to talk about it a little bit in the director's report today, but these are, in my mind, emerging as some of the most important issues facing environmental organizations at whatever level, federal level, state level, local level, across the country. Is that we have been blind to these issues for decades, if not centuries, and we're just starting to have the ability to see what we were intentionally or unintentionally blind to for so many years. So there's going to be a lot of important conversation about this, both in organizations like this, but with the public generally. So anyway, I think I'll stop there. I could talk about this for a long time, but it's a really important development in environmental work generally, is the environmental justice work and our tools to, first of all, see these issues and then start to talk about how do we address the issue.
Well, thank you. All right. Great conversation, and yet we must move on. We want to hear about the aquatic life use rulemaking development. And we have a team to present that for us. Please come on up to the table, and we'll let you introduce yourselves. Welcome.
Good morning, Chair George and members of the commission. My name is Jennifer White, I'm the Water Quality Administrator, and I'm gonna introduce this item, and then I'm gonna step to the side and let Connie Dow come to the table and give you the presentation here. So today, we're excited to be able to give you some information about the work that's been occurring in our water quality standards program. What we're calling the Aquatic Life Use Update Rulemaking. So I've got a lot of really expert folks here at the table to give you an overview of the work that's been going into this so far and where we sit with this effort. Today, we're going to talk about the objectives for the rulemaking project, the background information on beneficial uses and water quality standards, the process, scope, and timeline for this project, and where we currently are in the technical and stakeholder processes. So this work that's been going on right now has been a long time in the making, and they'll I've got Deborah Sturtevant, who's the Water Quality Standards Program Lead here, who's been working on fisheries and temperature issues and is a state expert on all of that stuff to help lead us through this conversation today. And James Mcconaughey, who's the project lead, who is quickly becoming similarly expert in all of these issues, and Connie Dow, who's the manager of the Water Quality Standards and Assessment section, to take you through the work here today. So with that, I will turn it over to them.
All right, Chair George, members of the Commission, Director, and Deputy Director, good morning. I think we're just Connie's gonna let us just dive in. Next slide, Stephanie. Yeah, good work.
All right.
Okay, so the objective of this rulemaking is to update the aquatic life use designations associated with Oregon's temperature and dissolved oxygen standards based on the best available data. It is important that the beneficial use designations are accurate, so DEQ, applies the correct and appropriate criteria to develop wastewater discharge permit limits, assess Oregon waters and identify impaired waters, establish load and waste load allocations through a TMPL, and certify that federal permits and licenses for hydroelectric and fill and removal projects meet water quality standards, in addition to many other water quality programs that we administer. Next slide. The beneficial uses are part of the water quality standards. This graphic illustrates that the water quality standard is made up of the beneficial use and the water quality criteria established to support that use. Beneficial use designations set the protection goals for a water body and determine which temperature and dissolved oxygen criteria apply. And in the case of seasonal uses such as spawning, the use designations also determine when the criteria apply. Next slide. Oh, okay. All right, there we go. So under the Clean Water Act, states are required to establish water quality standards that provide for the protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife. However, fish and shellfish, or what we call fish and aquatic life, is a very broad use. And different species, life stages, or communities have different water quality requirements. Therefore, states may specify use subcategories. And Oregon has established the subcategories shown on this slide for our temperature and dissolved oxygen standards. Each subcategory has a different criteria to protect that species or community. The temperature uses are based on sensitive species and life stages, but the criteria also protect other organisms that co-occur. So you can see on the right, it specifies bull trout, salmon and trout rearing, red band trout, cool water species as, oh yeah, there you go, as having different thermal requirements and therefore different criteria. The dissolved oxygen subcategories were organized slightly differently, and they're based on an aquatic community or mix of species rather than being more focused on individual species. In addition, states may specify seasonal uses such as salmon and steelhead spawning and egg incubation. So through this rulemaking, DEQ is correcting and updating the state's use designations, meaning which use subcategories are assigned to each water body across the state. The rulemaking will also adjust the time frame to which seasonal spawning criteria apply. DEQ is not changing the criteria values with this rulemaking. We're only updating where and when the different criteria apply. Next slide. So why are we doing this at this time? The reason DEQ is updating these designations is to correct errors and incorporate data that has become available since the temperature uses were mapped in 2003. And also to designate the dissolved oxygen subcategories, which we had not previously identified in our rules. The enhancements to ODFW's data, our primary data source, which we are incorporating, include broader geographic coverage, more data on resident species, resident trout, whereas previously, prior to 2003, the focus was really on salmon and steelhead and Anaphymus fish, and more data on the timing of various life stages. So that database has been building over the last 20 years. In addition, Fish and Wildlife has designated critical habitat for bull trout in federal law. So we want to incorporate all these additions. Now, many current use designations will not change, but where we have new or improved data, the uses will be corrected and updated. Next slide. In addition, there's also been improvements to our GIS system and mapping capabilities since 2003. DEQ now uses the National Hydrography Dataset, which is the state standard for the water body base layer. When we mapped in 03, it was called StreamNet, and it was a coarser mapping scale. And we can now more accurately map estuaries, lakes, and reservoirs. In addition, we want to capture where habitats are now accessible because of dam removals or projects like Opal Springs, where passage has been improved. And in fact, the Pritchard River is one area where we now have anadromous fish and spawn upstream of the dam. So we will be adding that to our use designations. For all these reasons, this project was identified as a priority in the last 2 water quality standards reviews. Next slide, Stephanie. I want to touch just on the process we're using. The process for accomplishing this work includes 3 major phases. First is the technical development phase, which includes gathering the data, reviewing our methodology, completing the analysis, and writing technical support documentation. Throughout this process, DEQ has worked with the technical work group of fish biologists from multiple agencies and the tribes, and the members are listed in your staff report. Next slide, Stephanie. Here we go. Second is the policy review and public involvement phase, and this will include developing use attainability documentation required by the Clean Water Act, the fiscal and economic impact statement, getting input from a rulemaking advisory committee, and then finally publishing the proposed rule amendments for public comment and holding a public hearing. And then the last phase, next slide, will be the formal rulemaking process where we bring proposed rules to the Commission for action and then submit those to EPA for their approval. And then during the EPA process, they consult with NOAA Fisheries and U.S. Fish and Wildlife under the Endangered Species Act, and they also consult with tribal governments, and then they would take their action. So next, I'm going to let James take over and talk a little bit more detail about the project, and then we'll come back and summarize.
Let's see, it looks like Commissioner Addington.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, Commissioner Kyle. And I'm sorry, I didn't, is it Deborah who's talking?
Yes.
Deborah, the chart that you had with the dissolved oxygen and temperature standards, where do those come from? Does DEQ figure those out? Do those come from EPA?
Chair George and Commissioner Addington. Those are developed by DEQ. And when we, they've been in rule for quite some time now, but have been revised somewhat over the years. So in temperature, we first adopted most of these categories in 1996. But then in 2003, we worked on them with an interagency committee that did include EPA as well and the Federal Fisheries Services. And the dissolved oxygen categories have been in rule since 1996 as well. But it's we developed those as part of our standards development and adoption process.
And those are standard for the state for cold water or for freshwater habitat, right? They don't change by region or anything like that.
The categories that are available apply to the whole state, but various water bodies or various regions will have different uses assigned to them depending on what is occurring in that particular location. So, like for example, red band trout are primarily on the eastern part of the state, and rainbow and cutthroat are more on the western part of the state. So the red band, that's why red band trout is kind of called out as a separate use category and has a slightly higher criteria, the 20 instead of salmon and trout rearing, which is the 18, because it's from a different location. So that happens in a number of our standards. And yes, these are all for fresh water.
Yeah, okay. I don't need to take time here. I'm interested in this, just like to maybe follow up with you at some point.
Certainly. Chair George, and if at some point it's beneficial to kind of walk through more detailed background on the standards, we'd be happy to do that.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Okay, so I was going to let James take over and give a little more detail on this project.
Chair George, members of the commission, my name is James Mcconaughey. I'm the standards specialist with the Water Quality Standards Program, and I'm also the project manager and technical lead for this rulemaking. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the specific components of the rulemaking project and the technical development process we use for the updates. Advance a bullet, please. So the project, scope of the project is divided amongst three main components. First is updating the existing use designations, which are associated with the temperature standard. Advance a slide, please. Second bullet. Thank you. These are addressing the designations that are already present in our rules, and so we'll be amending those. This includes what we call year-round fish use categories, which Deborah just mentioned on the slide in previous discussion about the criteria, and seasonal spawning use categories that are in Division 41. Second is we're formally designating where and when subcategories in the dissolved oxygen standard apply, and this is for the first time in our rules. We'll be adopting procedures that we've documented and used to implement the DO standard since 1998 as the basis for the rules. So there'll be some consistency, but they've never been in the regulation. The designations for the uses have never been in the regulations themselves. And then in addition to those, there are two minor miscellaneous rule amendments that are included in this project, and I'll describe those a little bit in more detail later on. All of these proposed updates require supporting documentation. Where we are amending existing use designations, there are federal requirements to conduct what's called the use attainability analysis that needs to apply, and we're working with the state closely on that. Next slide, Stephanie. The temperature use updates are pretty much the major component of the project. The primary task of this update is to complete first a statewide evaluation and update of the existing designations that are associated with our temperature standards. We have those in our regulations, or what we call colloquially our fish use and spawning use maps and figures. Those are part of our basin specific rules. People might be familiar with those terms. Those relate specifically to temperature. The main goal for this is to incorporate, as Deborah said, those 18 years of additional habitat data that's been collected and compiled mainly by Odfw and also federal and other agencies and organizations since 2003. Advance the bullet, Stephanie. Advance another bullet, thank you. Oh, back one. Back another slide. There we go. I think there's a section missing there. Second, we're reviewing the designations specifically for bull trout spawning to make sure they conform with the final critical habitat rule that was adopted by the Fish and Wildlife Service in 2010, just after we designated these uses for temperature in 2003. There's also some a small number of waters that were identified in the Fish and Wildlife Service's biological opinion for 2015 they requested that we add, and so we're including that as well as part of this rulemaking sort of housekeeping and updates for this. And the third element of the temperature use updates is we're proposing to add additional waters to what is our core cold water habitat designation based on the availability of temperature data that's increased since we last did this effort. We use this data mainly to identify streams that provide cold water throughout the summer to support habitat for cold water fish. This includes tributaries that provide cold water refuge for fish migrating in the Columbia River main stem that EPA identified during their cold water refuge plan for the Columbia River a couple of years ago. Next slide, Stephanie. Thank you. The second is the new designations that are being developed for the dissolved oxygen uses, and this is the other main topic of this rulemaking. And these are partially informed by the results for the temperature use updates. They go together. So the first part of that is since the water bodies for each use associated with the DO standard have not been designated in a rule before, the main task is organizing these and putting them into the rules. I mentioned earlier we have the standard implementation procedures that we've been applying to apply this criteria to water bodies in our Clean Water Act programs that we've been developing since 1998. And the methods we're going to adopt into rules are going to remain consistent with many of those current procedures, but will be formalized and adopted to the regulations. Deborah mentioned this also, while there will be some changes because we're taking advantage of new information that's available, many of the waters we expect will be similar to where and when we've been implementing them in the past. A second portion of the DO designations is a special focus on improving the way that DO identifies resident trap spawning areas for designating the sound-mounted spawning use in the DO standard. This category in dissolved oxygen includes both migratory salmon steelhead populations as well, which are already identified under the temperature rules, as well as resident trout and related cold water fish species. There's historically been a lack of specific information in the state on the location of resident trout spawning areas, and there are still some significant data gaps. Previously, DQs relied on a highly conservative process that assumed essentially any water body in a basin where trout are present could support resident trout spawning, and we applied the standards accordingly very broadly. DQ is working on methods that will address the gaps and allow us to focus protections on waters where the resident trout spawning is more likely to occur within those basins, while still being sufficiently conservative to protect the use given uncertainty there. Next slide, Stephanie. Advance the bullet, please. Our technical development process combines the requirements of our regulations with the data that we have available to identify the habitats across the state. And this is a conceptual model of the way that process works. Our starting place is with the water quality standards that are in our regulations. Within those standards, it defines what each use category is and the species or communities that are supposed to be associated with those criteria. And we combine that with the sources of data that gives us the means to identify the locations of the populations and habitats. So we can assign those uses to water bodies throughout the state. We were assisted in identifying and interpreting the data sources by an interagency technical work group. I'll speak a little bit more detail on that in a moment. And so the data and the regulations get combined through a methodology that we refer to as decision rules. And these are a logical chain of operations that provide a transparent and repeatable way to combine the data for identifying water bodies where each use specifically occurs. And that way we can target those water bodies for protection that's consistent with our regulations. In 2003, DEQ published decision rules as part of the rulemaking record when these were first designated. And so we're mostly using those same rules with adjustments to account for fitting new sources of data or new variables into them and account for any gaps we've identified with the methods in the original rules. As a result, the majority of uses that we identify, I keep saying, are not likely to change, but there will be differences in the areas where the amount of quality of data has increased.
Mr. Slusser.
Thank you, Chair. I understand that you're anticipating that most of these designated uses won't change, but if a water body's temperature has increased over time, would you then change the designated uses or downgrade the uses to reflect like the increase in temperature?
Sure. We don't use the change in temperature as an objective to removing waters or changing. The only thing that changes us is if the habitat, if there's more information about the habitat that shows maybe we were incorrect in applying the water criteria to those in the first place. The only time we do use temperature data is to add waters to a higher protected use because it shows that temperature data shows they're already attaining a higher criteria.
Okay, but you don't downgrade uses.
Not a temperature.
Chair George, if I could just add to that. Our existing uses really are need to be based on uses that have occurred since 1975 under the Clean Water Act. So that kind of the highest attainable use that's occurred in that time frame. We have a lot more data on what's happened more recently than in that older part of that time frame. But we're really looking at the habitat that's available and that would be appropriate for various uses, as well as the presence of the fish. If something had happened to a particular stream and there was an objective to make an argument that that use isn't attainable because of some reason, then that would be really a site-specific process to go through an evaluation and say, why is it not attainable, and provide the data and, show that that's not going to be a restorable use if it is historic.
Stephanie, advance the bullet, please. Thank you. So finally, the end product of applying those decision rules to the regulations of data will be a depiction of the aquatic life use designations and the water bodies that fit under each of those. And so this is a depiction of the water bodies that get assigned to each use. Often we do this through maps or tables that are adopted in the basic specific rules. Next slide, Stephanie. I mentioned DEQ was assisted by an interagency technical work group. A list of the membership is in the staff report. And by and large, the members of that work group are entities that either generate or maintain databases of authoritative data on fish habitat distribution for Oregon. And they helped DEQ provide expertise to help us identify, access, and interpret that data. The preliminary data source for the project is provided by ODFW. It's called the Fish Habitat Distribution Database, and shortened to FHD. And ODFW surveyed a lot of habitat in the state over the years, and they also compile data generated by federal wildlife agencies, tribes, or submitted by other third parties. We're also using some specific data from the federal critical habitat designations and biological opinions from the Fish and Wildlife Service related to bull trout. In addition to the fish habitat distribution, I mentioned we supplement data with temperature data to help identify water bodies that are maintaining colder temperatures, so we can highlight those for protection. We're taking advantage of a large increase in the availability of continuously monitored stream data that's occurred, temperature data that's occurred since 2003. DEQ itself monitors temperature data in many water bodies in the state and also acquires additional data that's submitted by stakeholders during our integrated report call for data, so we're able to leverage all of that into this process. The Forest Service has an extensive database of temperature monitoring related to the Norwest Temperature Model Project. So these are direct observations that feed their model. And in some places, that's temperature data that goes back almost 30 years from water bodies. Finally, EPA collected a lot of fine-scale data on cold tributaries to the Columbia River that provide cold water refuge for migrating salmon and steelhead. The temperature data shows water bodies that attain what we call our cold water or cold water criteria, which is one of our more stringent criteria. Those that are meeting it throughout the summer can be designated. And this helps maintain thermal diversity across our landscape and provide thermal refuge for fish, thermal refuge for fish and other aquatic species. So it's not necessarily related to habitat in those situations, but to attaining that temperature. We have a technical support document details how we use and apply temperature data, as well as some of our other methods. And that temperature data is only used to add waters to this higher category of protection. Next slide, Stephanie. So at the end of all that, what will the results look like? As I said earlier, because we're relying so much on our pre-existing decision rules and methods and implementation procedures, the majority of water bodies are likely to hold their designations as currently implemented by our programs. But there will be also changes. Some waters will change uses to uses that have a more stringent criteria. So from a less stringent to a more stringent use. This mainly occurs where dam removal, restored passage, or reintroduction of populations have restored access to waters that were previously inaccessible to those fish or aquatic life. We also have the digital temperature data, which really has increased our ability to identify waters that are attaining a high temperature standard. Some waters will change to uses that have less stringent criteria. These mainly occur in places where the existing designations in 2003 were based on incomplete or provisional data that's since been replaced with more specific data. There's a lot of professional judgment that went into the 2003 database because there wasn't the amount of field work that was done that Odfw's done in the last 20 years. So we're sort of replacing estimates or judgment with more hard data since then. This includes that special focus to identify resident trout spawning habitat and address those data gaps for the dissolved oxygen standards. And there are also some hydrography and mapping errors that will be corrected that were based on our switch from the stream hydrography to the higher resolution NHD hydrography. And those are situations where it's basically error in the mapping and the habitat use hasn't, underlying habitat hasn't changed. Next slide, Stephanie. Thank you. And finally, we mentioned there are two miscellaneous considerations for rule amendments while we're amending the basin-specific rules that are part of the rulemaking package. The first is clarification of conflicting aquatic life definitions that show up in Section 2 of Division 41 of our rules. These definitions use the term cold, cool, and warm water aquatic life, which are terms used in the dissolved oxygen uses. However, those definitions were added as part of the temperature amendments in 2003. And the definitions are inconsistent with the way those terms are used in the language of the dissolved oxygen rule itself, which can lead to some confusion. And so our goal is to reconcile or remove those definitions to alleviate that issue. Second is there's been a longstanding need to review and correct pH criteria for the Crooked River and Trout Creek subbasins to better match naturally occurring background levels of pH in these basins. So this would make the criteria more consistent with those applied in nearby and ecologically similar Eastern Oregon basins. So there's sort of the ecological difference between the west side of the Deschutes Basin and the east side. And the east side is more similar to the rest of the kind of eastern part of the state. Next slide, Stephanie. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to sum up. We just have 2 more slides and we'll sum up and then be happy to take questions. So I just wanted to summarize some of the key issues. Again, it's our goal to ensure that Oregon's use designations are accurate and based on the best available scientific data in order to apply the correct and appropriate criteria to each water body. Second, we are working with EPA to identify what documentation is necessary to support the proposed revisions, especially where the updated use has less stringent criteria than the current use. That would be, what other documentation in addition to the primary source of data we get from ODFW. And then lastly, data about where dissolved oxygen uses occur is still incomplete, as James mentioned, or at a coarse scale, particularly for resident trout spawning areas. And therefore, we will need to figure out how we'll address that use now, and then think about how it can be easily or efficiently revised in the future as additional data becomes available where we don't have it at present. So next slide, Stephanie. We just wanted to briefly touch on the schedule. So we are currently in the process of introducing our proposals to a rulemaking stakeholder advisory committee. The membership for that is at the link online. The link was provided in your staff report. It's a pretty big group this time, so I think we have a good array of interests on there. We will be getting input on the fiscal, to use for the fiscal and economic impact statement, and on the rule from that group. We're also just at the tail end of our technical work group. They have one more review of the technical support document that they'll do for us in June. And then we're looking toward having the public comment in the fall, and then bringing the proposed amendments to the commission next March. So that's our status report for today, and again, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you. Do you have any questions for the presenters? That doesn't look like it. Well, thanks again very much, and we know that this will come back to us, so
Yes. Thank you.
we're going to stick with our water theme here and move on to the 2022 Water Quality Integrated Report.
Great. Good morning again, Chair George, members of the commission. I've been Water Quality Administrator. And I'm pleased to bring you a second panel on water quality this morning. We're here to talk to you about the Oregon's 2022 integrated report. And with me, I have Connie Dow, who's the manager of the Water Quality Standards and Assessment section, and Travis Pritchard, who is a water quality analyst in the Water Quality Assessment program. So today we're going to be discussing the general requirements and the process associated with the water quality assessment, how we address the public comments, and the findings of the 2022 integrated report. As you know, we're required to develop this report every 2 years and report to the Environmental Protection Agency on the condition of Oregon's waters. And so this presentation today is talking about how we are meeting those requirements of the Federal Clean Water Act. And just as I think our motto at this point in time is that the integrated report is the most comprehensive reporting on Oregon's water quality that we produce here in the state. And so, and there's been a lot of great work that's been going into developing this effort, and we are not to steal their thunder, but we are on the cusp of submitting this to EPA imminently, within business day, within almost a business day or two, I think. So you're getting a little bit of a sneak preview here about the work that's been done on this. And now I'm happy to turn it over to Connie and Travis to discuss the process and requirements and some of the preview of the findings that we have for this iteration of the integrated report.
Jennifer, Chair George and members of the commission. My name is Connie Dow. I'm the manager of Forest Standards and Assessment section. Oh, Stephanie, next slide, please. I would like to start an overview of the Clean Water Act framework and to identify where our integrated report fits into different water quality programs and processes. First, we start by adopting protective water quality standards, which are the desired industry conditions for water quality to protect fish, people, and other uses of water-based waters. Then we use data and information from water bodies around the state to understand where these water quality standards are being met. Where they're not being met, we identify where and for what parameters they're not meeting standards. Then we'll develop TMDLs and permits to bring the water quality to meet the standards over time by controlling point sources and non-point sources of pollution. As the red circle indicates, the Clean Water Act contains two different provisions to govern the DEQ's responsibility for the integrated report. And we need to submit the report to EPA every 2 years, as Jennifer mentioned earlier. One requirement is the Section 305B requires the states to report on the overall conditions of Oregon's waters. And another section of the Clean Water Act is the 303D requires the states to specifically identify a list of impaired waters that are not meeting water quality standards. Rather than carrying out these two responsibilities separately, EPA has issued guidance and rules for combining these two requirements into one report, which is called the integrated report. As Jennifer mentioned, we need to submit this to EPA for approval every 2 years. Next slide, please. There are both federal and state requirements that apply for all states. On the federal side, you can tell from the slide that all states, including Oregon, are required to assess states' waters every 2 years. When conducting assessment, states must use all existing and readily available data. There is also a requirement that states conduct a public notice period before submitting the report to EPA. So to ensure the public and Oregonians have the opportunity to provide input prior we submit the report to EPA for approval. Again, the federal regulations apply to all states. There are also Oregon specific requirements that only applies in Oregon. Oregon statute requires DEQ to first publish the assessment methodology following an opportunity for public comment and input. This is prior to gather and analyze available data to produce the draft integrated report. So this is a public notice only on the assessment methodology, not the report. Also, our statute requires a peer review when the methodology addresses complex issues of science and technical analysis. Finally, our statute requires a briefing to the Environmental Quality Commission on the assessment methodology and the comments we received on the methodology, and it provides another opportunity for public comment during EQC meeting. We presented the assessment methodology to the commission last September at the EQC meeting, if you remember, a year ago. So as a result, Oregon's integrated report has two separate public comment periods. One is for the assessment methodology, and another one is for the draft report. The value for the two public processes is the ability to develop the methodology in a transparent, objective, and open forum based on sound science prior to conducting the water quality assessment. Next slide, please. This schematic shows the integrated report process and the timeline. As I mentioned earlier, because of Oregon's specific state statute, our process begins with the prioritization of the methodology update for each 2-year cycle. What methodology topics we work on for each cycle depends on several factors, such as our commitment to EPA and our stakeholder and the internal water quality program input. Once the priorities are set, DEQ works to update and develop the assessment methodology, which is the second dot there. There is a public process component for the methodology update, like I mentioned earlier, which may involve independent peer review if the topic is complex in nature. Next step is to put the public the methodology for public comment. And there's a then followed by a call for data. We wanted to the public to provide the data they may have collected for the report. And then we assemble and analyze all the data and create the report. And then we put the draft report for public comment again. And after addressing all the comments from the public, and then we submitted the final report to EPA for approval. Like Jennifer mentioned, we're ready to submit the 2022 report next Monday, right?
This coming Monday.
This coming Monday. So, now I'll turn over to Travis to discuss the details and the findings for the 2022 report.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Next slide, please, Stephanie. Chair George, members of the commission, my name is Travis Pritchard. I'm a water quality data analyst in the assessment program. So I want to start with a bit of a background on how the report itself is structured. For Oregon's integrated report, the water quality assessment conclusions are reported at an assessment unit level. These assessment units remain fixed for each assessment cycle as we go forward, which is a change that we made in the 2020 cycle. Assessment units are segments or streams, rivers, or water body areas that are predetermined based on similar hydrology and represent similar environmental hydrographic characteristics. Assessment units can vary in size from less than 1 stream mile to greater than 200 stream miles, and they're further divided into 5 distinct types. So we have rivers and streams. So that's what you think of, they're linear, and those are medium and large streams that we have segmented. For our smaller streams, we have them grouped into what we call our watershed units. And so those are all of the smaller streams within a sub-watershed boundary that are grouped together into one assessment unit. We have water body units, so those are our lakes, reservoirs, estuaries, coastline units, so rights, and that interface between the ocean and land, and we have Oregon territorial units. Next slide, please. So past iterations of the integrated report process were significantly under-resourced and used inadequate data infrastructure. Timelines were historically not met. The 2-year timeline is very quick. DEQ received additional resources that were phased in during the 2015-2017 biennium for this effort. And we focused on several broad goals for our improvement efforts. First and foremost, we needed to modernize our data infrastructure in order to support significant amounts of data and evaluations that are involved in the process. Second, we needed to improve the overall process and DEQ's efficiency for how it conducts the assessments to ensure that DEQ can produce this information routinely, reliably, and with the public knowing how and when they can engage in the process. We also needed to be able to pull in all readily available data. There are lots of people out there in our state monitoring for all kinds of relevant data, and we need to be able to pull that into our systems in an efficient way, keep track of it, and understand the quality of that data. And also, we needed to improve how we interface with the public in this process, from getting the word out to people who can provide data to us, how we evaluate the data, and getting access to the results, as well as the underlying data information once the process is complete. Next slide, please. So in 2022, we took the foundational updates implemented in the 2020 cycle, and we made several additional updates to the methodology. These updates were presented to the Commission in September of 2021. First, we increased our usage of continuous data, primarily temperature, DL, and pH. In recent years, the cost of generating this data has decreased, which has given us more ability to utilize this data. These parameters specifically experience a high level of variability throughout the day. So using this data gives us the ability to have a more complete picture of water quality. DEQ has increased its capability to store this type of data, and our methodologies have been adjusted to make better use of this higher resolution data sets. Secondly, we've added more detail to our assessments, which allow greater clarity of assessment conclusions at a local scale. Our web map product will show assessment conclusions on a finer scale, which is in response to comments we received during the last cycle. With the fixed assessment units that we established during the last cycle, we now have the ability to begin to track changes over time, see how our water bodies are doing over time, and we continue to make iterative improvements to data access and data display. Additionally, we expanded the rationales that we published for our assessment conclusions, and we have created a robust process for delisting parameters, specifically this last cycle. Next slide, please. DEQ has undertaken a robust public engagement process for updates to its assessment methodologies. As mentioned earlier, DEQ is required to update its methodologies prior to data assessment of the report. This provides a clear and transparent update to our methodologies and ensures decisions are not being driven by desired outcomes. So we update the methodologies before we ever bring in data. DEQ held 3 informational webinars during the development of the methodology. And an informal public comment period during the methodology update. A formal public comment period was open for 45 days, and DEQ received comments from 17 commenters who gave us about 100 individual comments. A large number of comments centered around our assessment conclusions for those watershed units, as well as how we map and display them. DEQ held a call for data from February 1st through April 2nd. Where we asked entities collecting data in our state to submit it to us. We received data from 14 entities, with 4 of those data sets being marine specific basins. We received data from 13 last cycle, so we upped it a little bit. DEQ also pulled in data from publicly accessible databases, such as the USGS and EPA's Water Quality Portal. Additionally, we use continuous data temperature received as part of the data solicitation that occurred during the temperature TMDL budgets. After release of the draft report, DEQ held an informational webinar where we highlighted major findings, as well as how to navigate the new data display features that were created specifically for the site. Our draft report public comment period was open from January 12th through February 11th, 2022, and we plan on submitting to EPA, like we said, on Monday. So a little bit, next slide, please. I'd like to summarize some of the comments we received for the draft report. We received comments from 18 individual commenters who provided approximately 84 unique comments to us. Comments on the methodology include support of current efforts and continue to push to include methodologies for assessing ocean conditions and requests for clarifications on our assessment methods. We received comments on assessment conclusions, and that were based on commenters really digging into the data that we provided and questioning the conclusions that we made with that data. Many of these comments were helpful and led to revisions to the draft report based on the comments we received. Comments on underlying data included concerns of data quality, missing data, and the use of narrative data snippets. Comments on visual and data display supported DEQ's efforts to display watershed unit assessment conclusions at a more local scale. And there was some confusion over this increased level of reporting. We're hoping to, over time, make our reporting tools more user-friendly and more accessible. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the data that we assessed. We received data, or we have data for over 3,000 unique assessment unit or unique monitoring locations statewide. You can see on the map the geographic spread of those monitoring locations. We analyzed just over 7 million numeric results, about half of that being raw continuous pH data, so pH data on 15 different areas. We utilized data from over 100 organizations, with 14 of those submitting to us through the call for data process. Next slide, please. So as part of our new assessment unit accounting strategy, DEQ reports as counts or percentages of assessment units rather than stream miles, which have been in the past. Stream miles are difficult to work with as they change over time. Rivers don't stay the same length, and with the different types of assessment units where we have, stream mile doesn't make sense in a way or this, for example. While the number of unassessed units, some of the graphs cut off, I'm sorry. While the number of unassessed units may appear large in this graph, for a state with so much water, this number is actually pretty good comparatively. Additionally, the assessment isn't a monitoring program, nor do we manage monitoring resources, but rather we utilize data available to us from various monitoring methods. Statewide, we've assessed 41% of all of our defined assessment units. This is up from 39% in 2020. Of those assessed units, 87% are impaired for one or more pollutants. This value is consistent with the percentages we saw in 2020, and it's why we see so much purple or impaired waters on our wet map. Most of these impairments are temperature and are attributed to waterways that are too warm for fish species and certain types of water. DEQ is reporting the integrated report conclusions at the assessment unit scale, so that we're consistent with EPA's reporting style, where all individual parameter assessments are rolled into an overall status. So if one parameter is in category 5 or impaired within an assessment unit, then that whole assessment unit we say it's impaired. If none of the parameters that we assessed are impaired and at least one is category 2 or attaining, we say it's an attaining assessment unit, otherwise we say it's insufficient. So potentially an assessment unit can have one impaired parameter, 141 attaining parameters, and we'll call that an assessment. Next slide, please. So the story changes when we look at individual parameter assessment conclusions, so not rolled into the assessment. The 2022 integrated report contains over 37,000 parameter assessment conclusions. So when looking at the results this way, 38% of our parameter assessment conclusions indicate that parameter is attaining water quality standards. 15% of parameter assessment conclusions are some form of impaired, and 48% for the parameter assessment conclusions have insufficient data to say one way or another. So what I want to highlight in this picture is the picture of water quality in Oregon is much more nuanced than the map or assessment conclusions. Next slide, please. In this cycle, top 5 pollutants in category 5 remain the same as the 2018-2020 cycle. Temperature, DO, biocriteria, E. coli, and sedimentation remain the parameters with the highest number of assessment unit impairments, with temperature far outnumbering all those other impairments. These parameter impairments all indicate waters are not always fully supporting fish and aquatic life beneficial use. For example, stream temperatures could be too high during summer months for optimal fish habitat. E. coli impairments indicate that waters are not always fit for recreational use, as there may be some risk of exposure to pathogens. Next slide, please. Taking a wider view of the assessment conclusions, we can see that temperature is really driving the story for water quality in Oregon. Looking at dissolved oxygen and bacteria, we have about as many parameter assessments attaining standards as impaired, and moving over to toxics, metals, pesticides, and others, we have many more attaining water quality standards.
Yes, Commissioner Slusher.
Thank you, Chair. Does this chart include the segments that have incomplete data? Or are they just not included?
No, they're not included in this. Had we included, we would see for the toxics, organics, and inorganics, we have a lot. The majority of those would be insufficient data, and that's generally due to our standards being very low, where the labs have a hard time hitting those. So classify that as insufficient.
Director Whitman.
Yeah, I think this question's for, I'm gonna put Jennifer on the spot a little bit, I'm, a warning. So in the director's report, I'm giving a very short discussion of the most recent water quality index report coming out of our lab. And that report, unlike this report, is looking at a much smaller sampling locations, and it's looking at trends or lack of trends. And one of the notable things in that most recent report is for temperature. It's showing a fairly significantly higher proportion of improving trends than decreasing trends for temperature. And I know I'm putting you on the spot, and we haven't really had a chance to talk about this because the report just came out. But any comments on that you care to make about the water quality index report in relation to the integrated report, and more specifically on trend information around temperature?
Yeah, Director Whitman, thanks for the question. So I think one of the things that the index does, and my lab colleagues, forgive me if I don't get all my words precisely correct, but one thing that the index does is that it compiles a snapshot of basically grab samples. So it doesn't use continuous data. It goes out every 2 months, takes a sample of all of the parameters, temperature, pH, DO, nutrients, and then it compiles it into an index, and then in the analysis, it also teases out some of those various things. So one of the similarities and differences is you get kind of a nice snapshot. Most of the monitoring stations are also kind of further down in the watershed as well, and so they're deliberately placed in areas where you kind of get the aggregation of what might be occurring upstream, right? So you kind of get a sense of what's happening. So in terms of temperature over time, one thing is it's a little bit apples and oranges to be able to compare the index with what we're seeing in the integrated report, because the index is based on grab sample data. So you're going at a certain point in time and taking a sample. It is done throughout the year, so you do get some aggregation. But I would say, and I would say overall trends at those locations, probably generally that's some good news. We really want to look into that data further or correlate it with the data that we have in the integrated report to be able to draw more specific conclusions. As Travis and Connie talked about, we don't, for temperature, dissolved oxygen, particularly temperature, we solely use continuous data. That's the only type of temperature data we use in this. It gives us the best projection, and it's compared against our metric, which is based on continuous data and looking at what is the hottest week of the year and looking at whether or not it's been exceeded. So the metrics are a bit different. If we were to tease out temperature from this report and look at it side by side, that would probably be a more helpful type of analysis. And so I would say while the index is probably, that's probably some good news to see those trends. It's hard to say precisely how it plays. One thing in the integrated report that I'm interested in building out better in this report is, as we look at, we're at this point doing a really great job of meeting EPA's reporting requirements. But what we aren't able to do at this point in time with how we approach the data is that next level of analysis, which is, so how impaired is it? You know, so is it meeting, so for temperature, is it just not meeting a couple days out of the year, or is it chronically like months on end? We're not at a place where we can answer those types of information, nor other than saying how the status has changed from cycle to cycle, we've not built in those declining or improving trends into how we display the data here, which I think ultimately is something that is important to understand, this next level question when we see the types of impairments that we do see, to be able to inform actions and where our priorities are around these impairments and at a finer scale.
Sorry, quick follow up.
Yeah.
Is there trend data reported in the integrated report? If so, how is it reported?
Dr. Whitman, no, there is not trend data reported in the integrated report. That is not, this is, and from the Clean Water Act, we're required to report on status. And so that's a piece, and you've heard some presentation before, there is some work that's done within our TMDL program that kind of has come up from that need to be able to work with our designated management agencies on kind of a more local scale to say, how's implementation going? Here, we'll pull together some data for you and tell you, like at a monitoring station level, what are we seeing in terms of trends for some selected parameters. So we do have some trend data, and there's conversations that we're having within the program about how do we take some of that effort that's come up organically in our conversations around TMDL implementation. Are there opportunities to pull it in with what we're really beginning to have now that we're 2 cycles in, some very robust data sets and some way more powerful tools around data analysis, and plus with our laboratory's capability to store that data, we're well positioned, I think, to be able to begin thinking about some of those opportunities to better build out the water quality story from the data and capabilities that we currently have.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Yeah.
Next slide, please. So it's not quite trend that we were talking about, but this is, like Jennifer was saying, this is basically the closest that we've been able to do so far. And this is in relation to the fact that we have these fixed assessment units. It is a second cycle now. So what this chart represents is the difference between the 2018-2020 cycle and the current 2022 cycle. The majority of our parameter assessment conclusions did not change status one way or another. And this is due to either new data that we assessed confirming previous assessment conclusions, new data being insufficient to bring that to a delisting point where we transition from impaired to attaining, or no new data assessed during the cycle. The next biggest group is brand new assessments where we did not have any previous parameter assessment conclusions before, and we have new data to assess during the cycle. And we have a few other attained to impaired, insufficient to attain. The 22 other represents some error corrections that we did between last cycle and this cycle. Next slide, please. This table represents the proposed delistings due to water quality standards attained. We are removing a temperature impairment from 28 assessment units. However, just about half of these are based on only 1 or 2 years worth of data, as our methodology did not contain any requirements to base the delistings on ensuring a minimum number of years in the data set. We'll be addressing this issue for temperature in the next cycle, 2024, and this is one of those downsides to the statute where we require the methodology approval before we start looking at data. We just kind of missed this scenario. We couldn't go back in the cycle and fix it without opening up a whole new public comment. In addition, we have 20 bacteria delistings and a handful of additional other delistings. You can see in the map here that the delistings are spread pretty evenly across the state. We're not seeing much regional concentration in our delistings. Once a TMDL or some other management plan is developed, a parameter assessment conclusion moves from category 5, which is what EPA considers impaired, use not supported, and TMDLs needed, to a category 4A, which is still impaired, but a TMDL is in place. EPA considers this move from 5 to 4 a delisting, and it will be reflected in our EPA reporting. So the numbers on this slide only represent delistings based on new data, including those 4As, along with some other minor error corrections from last cycle. We have 344 total delistings. Next slide, please. The integrated report will be submitted using EPA's new Attains database. There is no actual physical report. It's a reporting as a verb, not a noun. It's reporting to EPA. The report and other TMDL information will be publicly accessible through EPA's new How's My Waterway website. Locally, DEQ's display is broken into 3 interactive components. We have a story map, a web map, and a database. I'll talk a little bit about that on the next slides. Next slide, please. The interactive story map is intended to be our most user-friendly display in the integrated report. It's the narrative component to the integrated report and explains the report using a user-friendly narrative structure. Story map is how DEQ uses the integrated report data and assessments to tell a story about Oregon's water quality data. Its target audience is general public, non-water quality professionals. And the story map displays data by attainment status of beneficial use, which is the EPA's framework for the integrated report and how we want people to start thinking about the report into those beneficial use terms. Next slide, please. The second component is an integrated web map or interactive web map, which contains a mapping of all of our integrated report conclusions. This visual is an example of how we report EPA obscures the full picture of water quality in Oregon. There's a lot of purple on this map, and it's due to that. If one is impaired, it's going to show purple on the map. While this aligns with EPA reporting requirements, it does lose nuance on first glance. However, by clicking into it, there's a lot of information that can be pulled from this map. The image you can see we have for an impaired assessment unit, we have one stream impaired and one stream within that unit is actually attaining water quality standards. And this is a new change that we made this cycle where we kind of show water body by water body within this watershed. So users have a greater access to information. You can also, you can click in and see what beneficial uses are attained or impaired, what parameters are driving those conclusions. You can see what monitoring locations are for each assessment unit, and you can click on a water body to see all applicable water quality standards. Commissioner Addington, in reference to your question during the last presentation, you can use this map to see which temperature criteria apply to the water body. Just click on the water body and pop up standard information. This map is a continued work in progress. We are improving it kind of iteratively as we get feedback from stakeholders and general public. Next slide, please. The third component is for those people who are really interested in digging to the fine details of the assessment and are looking for information about a specific listing. We created an online database that shows the results of each of the assessments that were conducted. Users are also able from this tool to download the raw data that we used in the assessment, as well as any sort of calculations, criteria, values that we used to reach our conclusions. Each assessment that we did in 2022 also includes a detailed rationale about how we came to that conclusion. You can't see it on this map, but there's an example of this behind. I'm going to present it. So you see that this is a pH. This is a pH listing. It's got a list of the stations. It's a category 2 attaining, and you can see the rationale. So this one's attaining. 82 continuous time series days. So there's a whole kind of how we this is what we can kind of build on to do some of what Jennifer was talking about how currently we're looking at binary, impaired or not impaired, but with this we can start to build that message. Next slide, please. The one other thing that we didn't talk about is we also include a downloadable geodatabase, so municipalities or consultants or anybody else out there can bring in the layers that we use in the web map and in that database to kind of integrate into their own workflow outside of agents. In relative terms, DEQ is one of the nation's most comprehensive and data-rich integrated report assessments, which result in a broader coverage of assessed waters with more impairments attributed to waterways that are too warm for sensitive fish species at certain times of the year. Part of this comprehensive assessment is the protective approach Oregon takes to defining designated uses and in our protective water quality standards. Another part is the method Oregon uses to assess waters. As discussed earlier, we integrate data and information from a wide variety of sources, which allows our assessments to leverage water quality information efforts all across the state. Additionally, we utilize robust methodologies for performing these assessments. We strive to have our assessment conclusions reflect the true condition of the state's waters. We aim to minimize yo-yoing back and forth between impaired and attaining, impaired and attaining. We want to be accurate so that groups that utilize this data can have some expectations of into their planning processes. Next slide, please. Some challenges. So this year marks the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. This milestone has brought recent attention to the integrated report with a report titled Clean Water Act 50 promises half kept the half-century mark by the Environmental Integrity Project, and subsequent news articles summarizing the findings of these assessments nationwide. So in these summaries, using EPA's House My Waterway and EPA's reporting structure, Oregon has been identified as having the most miles of polluted or impaired waterways in the nation. As we have shown in previous slides, this is not a complete picture of water quality in Oregon. Additionally, these broad conclusions do not take into account important differences amongst states and tribes, which result in integrated report conclusions not being directly comparable from one state to another state. This is due to different water quality standards, assessment methods, delineation of reporting units. It is a apples to volleyballs comparison. The initial EIP report itself notes that these results are not directly comparable for these results.
Well, and I think it would also be fair, and this would fall under your different water quality standards, that as you noted earlier, we have these cold water fisheries that most, or many, certainly, if not most, states do not, that drive to a large degree our protective water quality standards. And if you simply don't have those, then these additional statements about this, what the standards will be, what the methodologies will have to be, will fall from that. And so it's really worth pointing out because, like you said, it's been a little bit easier in the reporting for people to come to some conclusions that I just simply don't know how valuable they are when, as was discussed here, as Connie and others walked us through, why we have the water quality standards we have. It's because we have the resources we have in Oregon, and we hope to keep protecting. So that's going to be my statement about that. So,
Thanks, Chair George.
Next slide, please. So I want to give one example of kind of work that we're doing upcoming. One example of Oregon's methodologies is a commitment to address ocean hypoxia and acidification during the next cycle. We received comments both during the 2018 and 2020, and then again in this current 2022 cycle, asking for the state to consider ocean acidification hypoxia. These marine issues are relatively new to the regulatory agencies, both in terms of understanding the science and DEQ's regulatory capacity. DEQ is approaching this issue by looking at the narrative biocriteria water quality standard, And we have formed a technical work group to help propose the best indicators to measure changes in marine biological communities. This work group is sister state agencies, there's Odfw, we have academics, and some other states, agencies from other states are involved also. Once indicators are selected, the group will focus on numeric thresholds that can be used for assessments to show impact to beneficiary support. With support of the work group, we'll develop an assessment methodology which will undergo an additional peer review process consistent with statute. And we hope to have all this ready by the next report cycle. Next slide, please. So our next steps is we say awaiting EPA approval. We will be waiting EPA approval after Monday. We are working to identify and prioritize methodology updates for the 2024 cycle. We continue to do work with our OAH technical work group, and we are making continued efforts to provide clarity to our reporting. Next slide, please. Chair George, members of the commission, that's all I have. Questions?
Well, thank you for that great presentation. That was a lot of information and I think it was really helpful. Do we have any questions or comments about this presentation? No? Okay.
I just have a question.
Great.
Just like sort of an extension of my previous question, but the data that you don't have, do you have strategies or plans to get some of that missing data? Or I know you mentioned that there's the issue with the labs not being able to detect. So like, are there technological improvements that you're anticipating?
So in terms of data gaps, I think there's a few different types of data gaps. There's gaps where we may not have any monitoring data, so there's just an absence of data. And then there's data that we have that we can't quantify because there's a mismatch between the levels we're trying to measure and laboratory methods available. So by and large, on the latter set, that's kind of a slow process in terms of, you know, at what rate can laboratory methods keep up with the levels that we're trying to both detect and quantify. And so that's something I would say, you know, kudos to our lab. We've got a very advanced laboratory who by and large is up to date with the latest and greatest in terms of methods. So as those become online, you know, our laboratory is actively implementing those types of methods. And unfortunately, I just don't think that's a field that moves at a quick pace on closing those types of gaps. In terms of monitoring data, you know, a lot of the data, as Travis and Connie talked about, is not data that, I mean, we use our data that we go out and monitor and collect for, but by and large, we are pulling in other folks' data. So I think one thing that we can do, you know, I don't know that our resources in terms of our capacity to go collect more data is going to change dramatically, but one thing that we can do for all the groups that are out there monitoring, one way this report can be used is to help highlight where do we have data, be clear about if people want to improve our insight into the status of water source. If data hasn't been collected in a location for a while and people think that it's actually maybe better than represented here now. It can really provide a tool for local communities, watershed councils, tribes, anybody else who wants to better inform our data. It's another tool for them to be able to use to help inform their data collection as well. And we've got a great process to be able to bring that in when that's available. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag in terms of how we can close some of those gaps, but I think we're, you know, hopefully those are things that can help inform not only our actions, but other people's activities on it too.
Jennifer, let me add that actually for 2024 cycle, we're already starting the effort of working with our permitting folks to expand data from permit applications, and also reaching out to our Hydro 401 program, trying to get that kind of data used for 2024. So we're this is continuous improvement, of course.
Water body data, not facility data, just
Water
to be
body
clear, in case anybody's.
and our water quality data.
Thank you.
That's great, thank you.
Good points. Okay, let's go ahead. It is now 11:25. Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. So let's reconvene at 11:35 for our last two agenda items. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Chair George, this is Stephanie Calder.
Story map is amazing.
Yes,
You
Stephanie.
saw me kind of paying attention to my computers because it was flipping through the digital
Very good.
maps. It's really user friendly.
And Commissioners, just one note, during the break, our audio will be muted and we will pause the recording. And before I do that, I do want to note, Commissioner Greg Addington, I believe you have a note for the room.
Just want to let folks know that I'll be back, but I'll be calling in for the rest of the meeting.
Okay, no worries. Thanks very much. Not something. Thank you, Stephanie. Something that we do often enough, which is to pause and recognize the people who make all this work that we have PowerPoints about and meetings about, but who make it actually happen on behalf of the people of Oregon and our great state. So I'm going to turn this over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Chair George and Commissioners. Richard Whitman, DEQ Director, and this is really a privilege on my part to be able to talk about the great employees and workforce that we have here at DEQ. And once a year, in the first week of May, federal, state, local, tribal, all public entities take a pause to recognize the great people and the public service that goes on during the rest of the year. And at DEQ, we do that through opening it up for nominations from anybody in the agency to nominate anybody else in the agency for recognition for public service. And this past year, we had 7 individuals who were nominated by their peers or their managers. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each of the individuals who were nominated. I just want to note again, we're now in year 2+ of pandemic, and just like any other organization, the pandemic and remote work for at least some of our workers has been a particular challenge. And I'm very proud of how workers at DEQ have kept the important work of the agency going during this challenging time. Let me start out by talking about the first nominee, first person that was nominated by their peers, and that's Angel Gillette. And if you could go to the next slide, please, Stephanie. There you go. So Angel is the manager of Your DEQ Online, formerly known as the Environmental Data Management System, or EDMS. This is the project, really the incredibly important modernization project for DEQ that we've been involved in pretty much from the time I started as director. Actually, we were just going into the procurement process of that. And we're about halfway through the implementation phase of that project with the rollout of those systems to various specific programs. But this project is about modernizing not just our IT, but modernizing our business processes in the agency. It's about how we work together. So it's sharing information between staff. It's about how we work with businesses and the regulated community who are sharing information about their operations with us, making payments. And it's also about how we share information with the public. So Angel Gillette was nominated as one of our ambassadors of public service. And the YDO work has been, obviously affected by the pandemic along with everything else. So the fact that Angel has assembled a top-notch crack team to work with the rest of the agency on this project, and it's just kept it going with so much enthusiasm, and she's such a pleasure to work with that she's just been an integral part of the success of that project. So thank you, Angel, for everything you do, and you really deserve the recognition. And it's a pleasure to be able to recognize the work you've done over the last year, you and your team.
Thank you, Angel. Yay!
So the next, if I could get the next slide, please. The next individual I want to recognize is actually with us this morning. Hi, Patty, I see you lurking there. Patty works in our Pendleton DEQ office. And again, this is a great example of work that folks have done to respond to the pandemic. So, you know, that office is virtually all remote at this point. And Patty is the one that has really kept things going in the office. She's the one that has come into the office and made sure that people have access to materials that they need. And Patty's done such a good job that she's been rewarded by being given more responsibility. So she has been promoted to be a permit coordinator, working on NPDES permitting and also our water pollution control facility permits and on-site permits in the eastern region. So she's doing permit coordination work and working with other people who are doing those permit reviews throughout the eastern region. So Patty's ability to help keep that office going, help support other efforts throughout the eastern region of DEQ really has just been exemplary. Thank you so much, Patty, for everything you do, and it's a very much deserved honor for you to be recognized as an ambassador of public service. So thank you, Patty.
Thank you, Patty.
All right, next slide, please. So next in line is from our Northwest region, Mike Kennedy, who's a water quality specialist, and Mike works in reviewing water quality permit applications, does inspections, works on compliance issues, and also provides technical assistance to permittees and businesses. More recently, Mike has taken on work as an after-hours spills duty officer. As I think commissioners know, in our spills program, we have a rotation among staff of people being on call 24/7 all the time if there are spills to coordinate responses. So Mike's taken that on in addition to his day job, and really appreciate his work both in the water quality arena and then in the emergency response team as well as duty officer. So again, Mike was nominated, and thank you so much, Mike, for everything that you do. Okay, next slide, please. So now we're going to come back to the YDO team, and Ramesh is another member of your DEQ's online team, and Ramesh has really been instrumental in the past year in helping keeping that project moving forward. As we've had the first wave of programs come into YDO implementation and actually launch and start working with businesses on YDO, one of the things that Ramesh has taken on is dealing with what are the bugs that come up, because inevitably in any big project like this, there are going to be bugs. So Ramesh has been working with program staff and also with folks in the regulated community as problems are identified to help track them and set up the work to get them fixed promptly. And that's kind of a thankless task because you're working with people. We've all been there. You've got a new IT program that you're working with, and it doesn't do exactly what you thought it was going to do, or something doesn't work. So Ramesh has been that in between kind of lubricant to get those things fixed and keep things moving. And again, it's kind of a thankless task. So Ramesh very appropriately was nominated to recognize his great attitude and can do problem solving work in keeping YDO going. So thank you, Ramesh.
Yay.
next slide, Stephanie. So yes, I love outfits. I'm really jealous, and I want to be there. So so Mike Mulvaney works in DEQ's lab out in Hillsborough, although he, as you can see here, likes to do a lot of field work also. So
All right.
Mike has been really a lead in water quality monitoring efforts at DEQ for a long time now, and has worked with I'll say generations of DEQ staff and interns, helping train them on what goes into our monitoring work, and getting them, for many people, getting them started in their careers as environmental scientists. So Mike also works in monitoring that's done for our landfill solid waste program, and he's been at this for over 20 years. Mike also participates in something we do every year out at the lab, which is the Children's Clean Water Festival, which helps teach kids about water quality and the critters that are part of why we care about water quality and protecting water quality. So as you can see from the photo, Mike has a great attitude, likes to have fun with his work also, and again, a well-deserved nomination for an ambassador of public service. Thank you so much, Mike. All right, next slide, Stephanie. And then the final award is, there he is, Jeff Navarro. Jeff is taken on the really tough task of being the team leader for our team of folks who are working on our NPDES permit backlog. And as you've seen, as the commission has heard in updates, and Leah and I get an update from Jeff every week on how are we doing on that backlog. And that, on the surface sounds like fairly straightforward, just have to roll up our sleeves and get through these permits that have been sitting out there for a long time. But almost every one of those permits that's been sitting out there for a while has been sitting out there for a reason. There are usually some difficult, thorny issues that have to be worked through on kind of a permit by permit basis. So Jeff, working with his team, working with the permittees, has been a large part of the magic of getting that done. And it's not easy, it's not always fun. Permittees are not always happy with that work and the results of it, but Jeff has kept it going and kept us more than on track on this, and maybe most importantly, leading his team of folks across different regions of DEQ and keeping the work going.
If I can just add quickly, I've heard at least 2 people in 2 other programs at DEQ say, we need a Jeff Navarro.
Yeah, so
Where's our Jeff Navarro?
So we had a comment earlier this morning about report being a verb rather than a noun. So now we've got a new a whole new term, and a Jeff Navarro is like a fixer.
Yes,
a fixer for DEQ.
Everyone wants to hire for that job.
Yeah.
So Jeff, thank you so much for your leadership for DEQ.
Thank you, Jeff.
Right. I have one more award to announce, which is actually a little bit different. And this is from something called the Federal Executive Board, which is the federal counterpart to what we do here at the state. Federal agencies by region have a similar sort of effort that they do same time every year. And this year, the Northwest region out of Region 10 nominated the team that is working on, and actually if I could get the next slide, please, Stephanie. The team that's working on water quality monitoring related to post-fire recovery. So you all recall in 2020, we had the terrible wildfire season. And one of the things that is involved in the recovery work for that is monitoring of how is the environment responding to those wildfires over time. So Aaron Borsenko is our lead water quality manager at the DEQ lab in Hillsborough, has been participating as part of that cross-agency, federal, state, local, tribal team to coordinate that monitoring effort. And so that team was recognized by their by federal leadership in the region, and Aaron specifically is a member of that team in terms of our work at DEQ coordinating with our other partner agencies on this really important effort. So thank you, Aaron, for your leadership on that effort and helping us learn from the terrible fires about how the environment is responding to that over the long term. So thank you, Aaron.
Thank you so much, Aaron. We appreciate you.
So again, I'll just say the 7+ Aaron individuals who were recognized this year are really just the tip of the iceberg for the great work that folks at DEQ are doing to protect our air, our land, and our water quality here for all Oregonians, for our health and for our resources, for our natural environment also. And just my heartfelt thanks to everybody at DEQ for the great work that you do. And I wish we could recognize even more people, but I appreciate everybody participating this past year and helping us tell stories for these 7 individuals that just exemplify the great work going on. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I want to take just a minute to add to Richard's remarks. I'm going to stand because I know it's hard enough for anybody who's on the line to see the small people in the large room. But I also want to stand in recognition and honor of these individuals that have been identified by their colleagues as the examples of the public servants that we all want to work with and that we want to be. I really want to stand in recognition and honor of you. And honestly, truly, I mean, in 2022, a recognition of ambassadors of public service, I think it's important for us to thank personally, as the EQC, all the employees of DEQ. For a short period of time, I myself was an employee of DEQ, and I can say that not everybody who comes to the department is tremendously excited about the opportunity to work with us. And you folks who work at DEQ, you're the ones who take those calls. The good calls, the bad calls, the medium calls, the calls where you have to talk somebody down and say, we can get through this. You know, let me connect you with so-and-so. They can help you. And I think that anybody who has that call to public service, I think that those are our special community champions. And I really, truly believe that about the people who choose to work in public service and all the employees who choose to work for DEQ. There is no DEQ without our amazing employees. We have lots of paper and we have rules, but it's the people who work in the lab, who work in the field, who work with the people. You are the Department of Environmental Quality. And none of the work that's done here, passing this motion or that motion or this rule, comes to anything without you being out there working with the people, working with the resources, and protecting the air and land and water quality of the state of Oregon. And so I very sincerely, on behalf of the EQC, want to thank you for your work. I hope you know how important it is. I hope you know how valuable it is. And I sincerely hope that our taking the time today can just be a reminder of how tremendously important we think you are and that your work is. So thank you so very much. We should do that every meeting.
Yeah. Actually, we are talking about how to have a more regular recognition of above and beyond efforts in the agency. And so I think doing that internally, but maybe having that be part of every meeting's director's report. So maybe just pull out a particular story.
There are so many. There are hundreds of amazing stories.
Yeah.
And so I think that's an exciting idea.
And with that transition, thank you, everybody. If it's okay with you, Chair George, we'll go to the last agenda item, which is the director's report.
Jump right in.
Okay. I want to start out by just noting an important occurrence or accomplishment really yesterday. I mentioned this briefly yesterday. We're involved in a lot of climate work here at DEQ and with the the commission also. But we're not alone in that. There are other agencies doing important work also on climate. And yesterday, my former agency, the Land Conservation Development Commission, or DLCD, adopted some really important rules. The climate friendly and equitable communities rules were adopted by LCDC yesterday afternoon. They still have a little bit more work to do, but those rules are going to make some significant changes in things that will affect transportation greenhouse gas emissions, things like reducing requirements, encouraging less parking is a way of getting people to use other modes of transportation, and maybe also to use parking as a way of encouraging cleaner vehicles. So we're talking across agencies for how to dovetail our efforts, and this is just another example of that. The rule at a high level will require major metropolitan areas in Oregon to do both the create plans and then implement them to reduce the amount of driving in those communities over time. And so we always think about transportation as cleaner fuels, cleaner cars, and less driving. And this is the less driving part of the work. So just want to acknowledge that good work going on at LCDC. On the maybe the flip side, not going to the gloom and doom part of the director's report. I've been doing a lot of work with the Bureau of Reclamation here in the last several months, and a lot of it focused on Klamath. And as I work with that federal agency, that's the federal agency that's responsible for water supply projects really across all of the Western US. We are looking at historic crises, particularly in the southwestern part of the nation with the Colorado River Basin, but also with river basins down in California. And yes, we're having lots of water problems here in Oregon with drought also, particularly in the eastern and southern part of the state. But when I look at what's going on in California, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Colorado, those Colorado Basin states, this is really serious. And we, United States, are going to be dealing with just enormous water challenges in terms of water use, in terms of use of water to generate electricity, in terms of collapse potentially of ecosystems in California. It's just very sobering. So as we do our work on climate, the sense of, and I think today is Climate Strike Day for youth in our country, I just have to note how the sense of crisis in terms of climate change that we are seeing, and whether it's drought, lack of precipitation, wildfire, and we're also seeing historic wildfires in that part of the country as well. It just, at least for me, just gives such a sense of urgency to the work that we're doing on climate and trying to lead the rest of the country and to some degree participate in leading the rest of the world in bending that curve down and starting to really tackle this problem before it really gets so bad that it's none of us really want to think about. So I just had to say that today. It's going to be a really tough summer for large parts of the country. Sorry for the gloom and doom, but
I touched the subject, so I'm familiar.
Okay. In your packets, commissioners, you've got an addendum, I believe, to the director's report, which is a summary of the Water Quality Index report. I mentioned this in the earlier presentation on the integrated report, but the very last slide there if you have it, and I don't know that we've got it available to put up on screen for people, but I'm just gonna talk, I want to talk about it for a minute. And it's the slide that's titled Sub-Indices Influencing. Well, actually, I'm gonna talk about the slide before, sorry for the misdirection there, but we have metrics or environmental outcomes that the legislature has set for DEQ, and this water quality metric, thank you, Stephanie, appreciate it, was set a long time ago, actually, I think 15, 20 years ago. But we're trying to get to a point where we've got 60% of the sites where we do long-term monitoring of water quality to be either in good or excellent condition. So just to note, we have been stable at that 49 to 50% level for percentage of sites in good or excellent, really for the last 10 years.
And those, of course, are the sites that we have monitored data for.
Yes, and as you heard, this is a small selection of the sites, and they tend to be lower in the basin, so they do represent the combined input of tributaries in the basin. So it's a bit of a macro level measure, if you will, of overall water quality. But that number has been pretty flat for the last 10 years. The percentage improving or decreasing, those numbers have moved a little bit around a little bit more, but you know, in this last year, we had more sites declining than improving. That's not a good thing. I think if you look over the last 10-year period, for the most part, it's been a little bit more in the improving category than the declining. So often these things are affected by climatic weather conditions. If it happens to be a particularly hot year with low flows, we can get bumps in those. So if I could get the next slide, Stephanie. This is what I really wanted to talk about, and I brought it up with Jennifer Weigel earlier, but just to, and you're not able to see everything. Actually, if you could move, Chair George, if you could move that bar so that you can see the bottom of the screen.
Right.
You want to just temporarily put it on that one bar?
Oh, just.
I think if you
just
move
bump
to
it
the
down.
side,
yeah.
there you go. So that first bar in this bar graph is temperature. And what you see is most of it's purple, so no trend. That means, when there's no trend, they have a threshold of statistical significance that has to be hit before they'll say there's a trend. And it's a fairly high bar. But the interesting thing here is that you see significantly more improvement than deterioration in temperature. I don't know why, but I'm going to ask a bunch of questions and we'll have some more discussion about this back with the commission. Same thing with pH. That's nice. But I'm also going to point out the bars where we're seeing more declines than improvements, and those are dissolved oxygen and nitrogen, and I think the other one is pH. Oh no, pH is improving. So dissolved oxygen, nitrogen, and there you go, total solids. So those parameters, if you will, often are associated with runoff from riparian areas, whether they be agricultural lands or to some degree forest lands. So, you know, what this says to me is we're continuing to have issues with runoff. The nitrogen is particularly concerning because adding nutrient loads to our streams is part of what's driving, along with temperature, our harmful algal blooms. and water bodies. So I just wanted to bring this to the attention of the commission and indicate that we're gonna wanna come back and talk with you a little bit more, not so much about attainment or non-attainment as we heard about in the integrated report, which is important, but trends. How are we moving in the state in terms of water quality? And there are we know there are success stories where water quality is improving in particular places, but we also know there are stories in some places where things are getting worse. And I think being able to talk about those stories is an important part of the picture in thinking about our work on, we're so focused on the TMDL work, not just focusing on status, but thinking about the trend part also. Okay, so that's really all I want. Thank you, Stephanie, for doing that.
And Richard, if I could just add one thought to that, an important part too, in terms of the implementation, is like the geographic trend, right? So like you said, we don't want to lose track of those good stories because we know they're out there. There are people out there doing good work. But geographically, what percentage, of that riparian area are we? The trends either moving in different directions. So anyhow, that's just something that is on my mind.
Okay. All right. I have one more thing I want to cover before I go into the written portion of the director's report. And yeah, were you able to access the documents on the rulemaking
It's
plan?
been sent to everybody electronically.
Okay, so just a note, Commissioner Addington asked earlier for a little bit of a update on the rulemaking plan, and we've sent to each of the commissioners the most recent version of the rulemaking plan, and I'm going to talk about it for just a sec here if I can find it. So we have
This chart.
yeah, so we have, I think I'm okay, thank you, Leah. We have roughly 12 rulemakings that are in some form of flight at this point. You completed work on 2 of those rulemakings yesterday, the zero emission vehicle rebates and the asbestos fees. We had an informational presentation on the Clean Fuels Program expansion, which will be coming to you in September. That is a significant, and you heard a fair amount of public comment on it yesterday. That's a significant rulemaking that will be coming. That draft rule will be going out for public comment here in the very near future, I think in a couple of weeks. And the Rulemaking Advisory Committee, I believe, was meeting yesterday or today, I can't remember which, on the last part of their work, which is the fiscal impact statement. Other rulemakings that are coming in the near future, there's for air quality, Klamath Falls area was in non-attainment, so there's a rulemaking for what's called the maintenance plan for Klamath Falls. A lot of that's around wood stove management, if you will, in that community. Clean Water State Revolving Fund. This is our main state fund for funding both wastewater and to some degree some non-point source projects also. We received significant supplemental funding from the federal government in the funding that Congress provided last fall, and that funding is coming with a direction that at least 49% of that funding be directed to environmental justice communities. I'm going to talk about environmental justice more in a minute, but we are going to be bringing a rule to you all for changes in our rules for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund to assure that we're at least meeting, if not hopefully exceeding that target in terms of the distribution of those funds. And we are also working with sister agencies at Business Oregon and the Health Authority on our drinking water revolving fund to make sure that that also is targeted toward environmental justice communities much more heavily than it has been in the past. We've done some analysis of where our funding has gone over the last 10 years, and I want to say this, and it's not through any ill intent, but a large proportion of our funding has gone to larger communities who have the capacity to put together projects and apply for funds, manage projects, have the rate base to pay for projects. And so as we think about how to get resources to communities that have not had access to resources in the past, there is fixing our criteria, but there's also how do we build the local capacity? And there are important efforts going on between non-governmental, local governmental, state, federal folks to try to address the capacity issues as well as the criteria issues. And I think that's extremely important work. We'll talk more about that as that rulemaking comes to you. Commute option rulemaking, this is the so-called eco-commute program that DEQ has had for decades that encourages major employers to subsidize, incent non-single occupancy vehicle commuting to employment locations. And so that's been focused in the Portland metro area. We are taking it statewide and proposing to expand that program. This is very much related to the work that I talked about the land use agency, DLCD, doing also in terms of encouraging less driving.
Richard, what's the time frame on that? Is that happening now?
That rulemaking the Rule Advisory Committee is just starting now. And so there will be several meetings of that Rules Advisory Committee. They'll develop the proposed rule. It'll go out for public comment, I believe this fall, and then come to you all early next year.
Okay.
The aquatic life use updates you just heard about, that's coming to you in March of next year. There's a rulemaking on waste tires that I'm not real familiar with, but I think it is scheduled to come to you in early next year. Some of you may recall with I'm just going to say it, Northwest Metals facility in North Portland, where there was a bad fire that resulted in a large part of the community getting relocated for several weeks. That incident caused us to relook at some of the rules around waste tires. And so this rulemaking is really a result of some of that. And then finally, the last one is a very important rulemaking around updates to Oregon's recycling program. You've heard prior presentations at prior meetings about the legislation that passed in 2021. I think I get that right. It blends together at a certain point. And so there are several advisory committees really coming out of that effort. One is Advisory Committee on Truth and Labeling that I think is making recommendations not only to DEQ, but maybe the legislature on truth and labeling, improvements in labeling around recycling. There also is a rulemaking advisory committee looking at the modernization of Oregon's program in several regards. One is the extended producer responsibility provisions. in that legislation, but also statewide uniform list of what is recyclable, so that we have consistency across the state. And so they're in the middle of that work right now. And that'll, again, I think, be coming to you in, I believe, early 23. So I know Commissioner Addington, I think maybe on the phone. And I'm going to try to do this at every meeting, just give you a quick update on what rulemakings are underway and what's coming, just as a little bit of a refresher. Okay, so with that, I do want to talk about the written report in several respects. Again, this is normal for me. I'm not going to go through every item in the director's report. If there are questions, any commissioner should feel free to ask me about them here, but I want to talk a little bit about diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and then environmental justice. So we have hired Jamila Thompson, another individual, to help with our work on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're now about 7 months into having our DEI council formed. They've been meeting regularly and often, and are developing their priorities and work plan for the work in the agency. And it's not the council's work, it's really the agency's work. So for the council, they are overseeing an organizational assessment of DEI at DEQ that is being done by an outside consultant, Engaged Change, that I think will provide kind of an important baseline for the agency on diversity and equity and inclusion, and where are the areas where we should be prioritizing efforts around DEI. So any questions about DEI work in the agency?
Well, is it just a matter of, it's been great to get updates on that this group is hard at work and that they're leading and in communication with the larger efforts. Is there a time frame where we're going to kind of start seeing some of their recommendations or what that work plan is looking like in the next few months?
I think we'll see their work plan in the next few months. I think in terms of the organizational assessment, I don't want to put a specific time frame on that, because I want to make sure they have the time they feel they need to get the organizational assessment done in a way that everybody feels is a good platform foundation for the work.
Absolutely.
I think it'll be sometime this year, but I don't know exactly when. You know, at the same time, I'll mention a couple of other things that are happening related to DEI. There is a team working on an update of our recruiting processes. We already had some updating of our onboarding processes. You know, there are discussions around employee retention. So there are a lot of different aspects of this work, and we do also have a brand new human resources manager in the agency, and so she is wrapping her head around I'll call it the more formal parts of equity issues in the agency as well, and whether we are assuring that DEQ is being accountable where we identify problems that exist in the agency that we're taking care of, that we're being accountable for getting fixed. And so that also is part of this work.
I actually do have one.
Yeah.
What we were talking about earlier about kind of like the censure of communities by using census tract data. Does that fall under this DEI initiative, or is that a larger state level kind of conversation between agencies so that everybody's using it more?
So Commissioner Kyle, that work is under the heading more of environmental justice, and I'm going to talk about that next. But the DEI work that I just got through talking about is really focused on internally within DEQ, how do we create a more diverse and equitable working environment within DEQ in terms of our workforce. Of course, having a more diverse workforce, having the work be more inclusive helps us work with diverse communities externally. So the two are very related. But it's important that we were paying attention in both of these areas. So I'm feeling good about the systems that we are putting in place around diversity, equity, and inclusion, but that is going to take time. Our workforce at DEQ is changing. It will continue to change, and getting to a workforce that that reflects Oregon broadly and where we are doing our work in an inclusive way that respects all parts of the agency is important for us to succeed in doing that external work also. So on the external work, on environmental justice, there's, I would call it almost literally an explosion of attention to this. And it's in a, I think, in a very good, healthy way. The Biden-Harris administration is trying to push this at the federal level. And Chair George, you referenced the analytical tool that EPA and the Council on Environmental Quality have been working on at the federal level that's out for kind of public review and comment. DEQ will be submitting comments on that tool on Monday. And I think some of the concerns that you raised are shared. And not only by Oregon DEQ, but by other environmental state level environmental agencies across the country. The tool that the federal government released for comment is not looking at racial characteristics of communities. And I think for sensibly for legal reasons, they felt they couldn't do that. And I'm not the legal expert on this, but how you can have a tool that has a purpose of identifying disproportionate burdens on communities without looking at socioeconomics and race, it's just, anyway, so we won't be submitting comments. At the same time, all that's going on at the federal level, the federal government and the Environmental Protection Agency are also telling states and others that they are going to be issuing new guidance to states on how state programs need to consider environmental justice in including in making permitting and regulatory decisions. And we don't know at this point exactly what that guidance is going to include, but we're also being told that EPA will be conducting audits of state programs, not necessarily every state, but they will be looking at state programs systematically to see how states are considering these issues. I think that's fine. I think we welcome that, and look forward to working with EPA on that, whether they choose to audit Oregon or not. We take this charge seriously. We have a legal obligation to the federal government when we receive federal dollars to be paying attention to environmental justice, and we have our own both legal and moral obligations as a state to be paying attention to these issues. So at the state level, the legislature passed very important updates to our environmental justice statutes in the 2021 session that modernize our, what has been the Environmental Justice Task Force, it's now the Environmental Justice Council. And also provide resources for the development of an Oregon-specific environmental justice analytical tool that will allow us to work with communities looking at community level impacts and community level historic burdens in terms of health and pollution. So the Environmental Justice Council will be leading that effort, and that's made up of appointees by the governor. They will be doing public engagement, community engagement across the state, and really hearing from communities around about what communities want to see in that tool before we get, this is not an agency driven effort. It is going to be it really needs to be a community driven effort. DEQ, along with the health authority, will be providing technical support for that effort. DEQ is, I guess, the expert on environmental data. Health authority is the expert on health data. PSU Population Research Center has the technical expertise on socioeconomic data. So we're going to be bringing all those technical tools together, but it will be up to communities to say at what geographic scale, what are the criteria that we really care about, and how do we, to a large degree, how do we want to use these tools, or how do we think these tools should be used? These tools will probably be and end up being used to some degree by agencies like DEQ, and whether it's administering a grant program and trying to figure out where to prioritize funding, or making permitting decisions and thinking about community level impacts. So that is an enormous body of work. We have an environmental justice work group within DEQ that has really been leading a lot of the technical work on this at the agency level within Oregon DEQ. Health Authority also has been working in this area, and we look forward to working together with community partners in the Environmental Justice Council to move this along. DEQ is staffing the Environmental Justice Council, so we are hiring a staff person for that purpose. We also are hiring an environmental justice coordinator to lead our own internal work around environmental justice, and we are hiring a lead on the data analytical work, the science work, to lead that effort for DEQ. The Health Authority is also hiring a lead on their technical piece. So we are essentially assembling a team of full-time professionals to work on this, along with a work group within the agency where people are devoting a small part of their time to helping work cross-program on environmental justice issues. That work group has been consulting with the state of Washington and the state of California, who are at least a couple of years ahead of us. In California's case, more than a couple of years ahead of us. So that's the bad news. The good news is we can learn from their experience also. But we're playing catch up in this area, and it is a very high priority for the agency. And we are making visible environmental public health impacts and issues that have not previously been visible. To your point, Chair George, earlier, that are going to lead to, I think, good, healthy conversations about our programs and how our programs are designed. And so this is work that I think will be continuing for a long time. So that was a mouthful. There's a lot going on in this area, but if anybody has, including Commissioner Addington, if he's there, have questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
play with that, because we won't see him if he's
Okay.
there. I guess my comment is thank goodness. And it's also very good to see that as the state is taking on and acknowledging the need for this work, we're resourcing it, right? That's something else that happens a great deal. We say, oh, this was an oversight. Agencies go do better work on this and find some time to, ask overly scheduled employees to do it. So hiring the right people with the right skills to bring the right tools forward is the right way to begin this work, that and engaging with the communities themselves. So I very much look forward to hearing where this work takes us. We know that it's very much needed. Ms. Schlesser.
I would just add, I assume and I hope that this will culminate in actual rule changes at some point, that some of these findings will actually be incorporated into the rules that the agency is implementing rather than just acting as more of a platitude.
Yeah, thank you. Commissioner, I will say that there are rulemakings coming to you later this year that will reflect consideration of some of these issues. So one of the things that the 2021 legislature did, among others in this area, was to require agencies to include in their rulemaking processes a racial justice impact statement. And this is brand new. It hasn't been fully fleshed out what that requirement means, but we the law went into effect January 1. So we are in rulemakings that are coming forward to the best of our ability without all these tools being in place exactly. We are consciously, intentionally thinking about these issues in every rulemaking that is coming before you at this point. So you should actually, so when you see rulemaking packages, you should start to see here in the future a racial justice impact statement in the rulemaking package. And it's probably going to require years to fully flesh out what that means and what goes into it. And of course, what goes into it is only as good as the information you have. So there's a little bit of a chicken and egg here, but we're starting to the best of our ability to do that now.
Which is great, and I think that that's a great step in the right direction. I just want to make sure that that's not where it ends. I mean, if you consider racial impacts and you determine that there are adverse impacts, but yet the existing rules say that you have to issue a permit if these certain boxes are checked, then it's kind of irrelevant that you've identified that there's a racial impact if you can't actually act on that information. So that's just what I would like to make sure that those types of changes are made so that decisions can be made that incorporate that information rather than just consider it and don't act on it.
So thank you for bringing that up. I will say in the permitting, leaving the rulemaking aside for a minute, in the permitting context, we have had several notable permitting regulatory decisions, some of which we're still in the middle of, where we have imposed conditions on a permittee that have been a result of this sort of analysis, where we have identified a localized, I'm going to say public health impact that we would not have picked up previously, that created the basis for a condition or conditions in a permit. So that is starting to happen. We don't have all the tools we really need to be able to do that as consistently as I would like, but that is under existing standards. We're not at this point changing standards. There is a subsequent conversation which I can see coming about whether the standards are adequate to fully consider whether it's a public health impact or an environmental impact of an activity at a localized scale. And this is when I say this is going to be years of work. That's going to be long-term work, and it's not only state level work. It probably is going to involve federal changes in federal rules and maybe even proposals to Congress. But I will just say for Oregon DEQ, we are, and this is just my personal opinion, we have not been either able or we have not looked at these sorts of localized public health or environmental impacts very well. Clean Air Oregon was a consequence of that. We're seeing other areas where it's important to have this sort of examination also, and we are moving in that direction. But you know, it is gonna take some time and effort to get there. But I think this is not just for Oregon DEQ, but I think for other environmental programs in Oregon and across the country. This is where I see us going as a society here in the coming years and decades, and it's long overdue. Okay, so very quickly, internal audit. So I am really sad to just make sure commissioners understand we have lost our internal auditor over health issues. Valerie Whitman had to retire, and Valerie was doing a superb job for us as internal auditor, and really, you know, even in the time we've had her, has really added value in a number of specific areas and specific programs. And so we're very sorry to lose her. We are going to be recruiting for a new internal auditor. And in the meantime, we probably, although we don't have this in place yet fully, we'll be contracting with Portland State, has an internal audit function, and they do consulting services for other public entities, including other state agencies. We'll probably use them where we have to kind of keep things going from an internal audit perspective, but hopefully we'll be able to get this position refilled here fairly quickly. I know other agencies, at least one other agency that's been recruiting for an internal auditor and has had difficulty finding somebody, but we're going to do the best.
I can confirm that. We too are having difficulty finding
Yeah.
the right people in audit. One question that is related, not precisely. So I appreciate Commissioner Kyle's work working on the new audit team as well. When the auditors produce their report, and I don't know if they was an opportunity to do that before she had to leave, but like, who does the auditor report to? Who do the reports go to?
The reports go to the audit, and the audit committee is chaired by Commissioner Kyle, and it meets quarterly.
Meeting quarterly.
And so that's the basic system.
Who else is on the committee?
Oh, there's 4 people. I need to check my cheat sheet.
So Commissioner Kyle is on, I am on the audit committee. Lisa Sumption, who is the director at Oregon Parks and a former, pretty well-known internal auditor, she's no longer doing internal audit, but she knows internal audit really well, is on the audit committee. So it's important to have somebody outside of the agency on the committee.
Sure.
And I'm trying to remember, I think Brian Bowling is on the audit
There's
committee.
2 Brians.
Brian from Solid Waste. Brian Fuller, yeah, I think that's right. So it's a mix of a couple of internal program managers, Brian Bowling's head of central services, myself, Commissioner Kyle, and Lisa Sumption.
Okay, thank you.
And I think in maybe more direct answer to your question, where there is an actual report that comes out from Valerie, we report, I'd say she and I report on that at least verbally in the direct, as part of the director's report. You may recall on the rebate program, and then I think also on some issues around cost recovery. I think there was a report out at the last commission meeting.
It's Brian Bowling, Brian Fuller, Connie Dow, Jacqueline Palermo, and it's a 17.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, the next item in the director's report, I've asked Deputy Director Feldon to talk about briefly strategic planning, and wanted to touch on that briefly because ultimately the strategic plan will be coming to you all for your input and ultimately your hopefully approval.
We've talked about this, commissioners, a few times here. Thanks, Director Whitman. The fact that we're just relaunching this effort. We had launched, we took a pause, and we're relaunching. And so part of the relaunch, because some time had gone by, was we had to do some more recruitment. We did that recruitment for some more steering committee members to move us through this process in the fall. So that recruitment, we did that through reaching out to our internal employee resource groups to bring about some more diversity of perspective on our steering committee. We also reached out, at the time it was our DEI transition team. That's when we were transitioning to our DEI council in the fall. And then we also filled in to have geographic and program diversity to ensure we had some diversity around our state offices and our different programs, of course, including our laboratory. So now that we've got the steering committee put together, they do have their first meeting scheduled for June 1st. We're working with 2 consultants. One's a consultant that really facilitates agency strategic planning efforts. So they're the facilitator, they're the expert in strategic planning. The other consultant, Director Whitman mentioned earlier, is Engaged Change. This is the same organization that is helping us with our internal assessment around DEI and also helping us with training around DEI. So they have those 3 pieces to their work that they're doing with us. So with those consultants, we're going to have that first meeting on June 1st. And the first meeting of the steering committee isn't really going to be about strategic planning. That'll be the second meeting. The first meeting is really going to be a meeting where we pause and have folks get to know each other a bit, get to know, what they do at DEQ, what brings them to that work, maybe any experiences they've had with strategic planning, any thoughts about it, any concerns about it, and start to develop what their process will look like. The steering committee gets to not just be told, here's the steering committee, here's the strategic plan process, but also help to develop it. And in particular, they're going to be talking about how do we engage others in the agency? How do we get others' input into this process along the way? What's going to be a way to make this transparent for our colleagues? And so that's going to be a big part of where they start with this work. So I'm excited. It's a really strong mix of expertise, I feel like, on this steering committee. And as Director Whitman mentioned, ultimately this will come to you. We believe our commission needs to approve a strategic plan for the agency, and we hope that this also really sets a path for the future for the agency. We haven't operated on what would be considered a traditional strategic plan at DEQ over the years, and this is something that we hope we will update every 5 years or so. It should be relatively high level. It's not going to have every action that we take, of course, but this is something that should live on and be used and usable, and hopefully including in budget processes, and then be updated on some sort of regular 5 or so year cycle. So we look forward to bringing updates to you, but the committee is going to be having 3 meetings within June and July, so they're getting off to a good start. So
Commissioner Slusher,
yeah,
How many members are on the committee?
13. Yeah, 13 committee members. That's what we were advised is a nice Goldilocks number of people.
Yeah.
We're still working through issues in terms of meeting in person or meeting virtually. We're trying to identify, which meetings would be better in person if possible, and still leaving room for people to, ensure that their own needs are taken care of and safety, and probably doing a lot of hybrid work through this process.
And will you be incorporating any like public input, community input?
Yes, so there is the strategic planning website that's going to be developed over time. I'm gonna look for a little bit of direction from the steering committee on what kind of interactive abilities that has. In addition, part of, I guess I'd say, a more traditional strategic planning process that we had begun when we worked with our consultant in the first iteration was having an environmental scan. And in that process, the facilitators actually talk to different stakeholders, members of the public, other agencies, governor's office, commissioners, other folks internal at DEQ, and survey and talk about, their needs, interests, desires, concerns around DEQ and DEQ's work. So this committee is going to take a look at that, recognizing that it's over a year old now, and see, are there some gaps that need to be filled? Are there some voices that we missed, and some others to be talking to through this process?
Great.
All right, Chair George, just I know we're a little bit over time now, so just want to check with other commissioners. I'm going to try to spend about 5 more minutes and then just wrap up on maybe the most important things that are left in the director's report. Does that sound okay for everybody?
sounds okay to me, and if you do have any other questions from the report, or maybe just kind of be looking to those and have those in mind, so we can address them with the director, but go right ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to go right to the lower Umatilla groundwater management area that Commissioner Addington brought up earlier. And what I want to say, we've already talked a little bit about Moro, and I've mentioned Lamb Weston also. What I really want to say is those are 2 important facilities operations, but they are by no means the only source of groundwater contamination in that area. We know that we also have groundwater contamination that's resulted from some of the confined animal feeding operations in the area. And of course, we've got a still pending permit application, potentially for 1 large dairy in that area. We also, and perhaps more broadly, have issues with regard to fertilizer application by agricultural operations in the area. It is also true that the levels of groundwater contamination vary significantly between different portions of that area. I think as we move forward working with local interest in the area, we really want to focus in on those more localized areas of higher nitrate and really identify the specific sources that are contributing to those areas of most concern. At the same time that we also work with partners to address the drinking water side of things, at least particularly here as we're doing the long-term work around stopping things from getting worse and actually reversing trends in nitrate levels in groundwater. In the meantime, we need to be making sure that everybody who needs drinking water in these areas is having access to clean drinking water. And that has been a more recent focus of efforts with the health authority. the county public health departments and other, frankly, other, including agricultural interests in that area, have been pushing to advance work on that front. So we don't have everything put in place there, but we're working hard to get that piece in place here sooner rather than later. And so, you know, if you were just reading the newspaper accounts of what we call La Guama, you would think everything is about the Port of Moro and Lamb Weston. And while those are certainly important, they're not the only problems in the area. And even more broadly, DEQ for several biennia now has suggested that we need a broader public process around our programs for protecting groundwater. And do we need legislation to improve the systems that we have for groundwater protection? We are going to propose that again in this coming cycle, and I'm a little more optimistic that maybe we'll get some traction on that, because in my, again, personal opinion, are the statutes that were put in place now almost 30 years ago for drinking water protection. They've worked in a few areas. The Malheur in particular, we've seen that local community be pretty effective in terms of moving from flood irrigation to sprinkler irrigation. We've seen improvements in groundwater nitrate levels, probably as a result of that moving away from flood irrigation. But we don't see the same improvements in the Umatilla area, and we have other areas in the state where we have either nitrate or arsenic contamination of concern. And we're overdue for a look at the adequacy of our systems. And I think DEQ will again be proposing to whomever our governor is and the legislature that they take this issue up. So I just wanted to put that out there, and I'd be happy to answer any specific questions there are about the Umatilla, but that just gives a little bit of context for the broader effort going on.
And Commissioner Addington, if you are with us and you have additional questions that you'd like to ask now, and at least take the opportunity to address them a little bit, I want to just reach out to you and see if that's the case. It's also just fine if you don't. Okay.
Hey, can you hear me?
I'll hear you now.
Yes, we can.
So I am listening, and I just want to let you guys know, and Richard, I appreciate the report there. Actually, all of your report has been great.
Little hard to hear you, Commissioner.
I'm sorry. Anyway, everything was great. I'll hold. I don't really have any particular questions. I just know that this is a big issue in the Umatilla and deserves a lot of focus from everyone.
Thank you.
Absolutely. All right, we will keep the commission updated on what's going on the Umatilla, and I think at our next meeting we'll have some more discussion about the broader issue around groundwater protection. I don't know that we'll have a specific agenda item on it, but certainly as part of the director's report, we'll talk about it some more.
Good.
Riverbend landfill, for folks who have been on the commission for some time, know that's been an issue that has come before the commission from time to time. And the thing I wanted to signal to you all that is, I think, important is that we are working with the permittee on a closure permit for Riverbend. And that will, once it's issued, will set a specific timeline for closure of that facility. With that said, I also want to emphasize that doesn't mean that they necessarily will close. It just means they can always apply for reactivating the facility or expanding the facility. But just to kind of put out there, we are working to put them on a specific timeline, but if nothing else changes, it will close. I think with that, I will note for one other facilities, the Zenith facility in Portland, in Northwest Portland, the Court of Appeals affirmed without opinion the LUBA decision, which they essentially upheld the decision of the city that denied the land use compatibility statement for the expansion of the Zenith operation, but also remanded it for supplemental findings by the city for specifically why it did not comply with comprehensive plan provisions. So we don't know at this point whether Zenith will seek review in the Supreme Court. They may, Oregon Supreme Court, and but assuming nothing changes, what this means is it'll come back to the city. The city will need to review its findings and update them and make a new decision on the land use compatibility statement, which then could get appealed again. But maybe not, I don't know. So Zenith saga continues, is kind of the short story there, but I think that from this, you know, again, the affirmation of LUBA's opinion that it was essentially proper for the city to deny the land use compatibility statement, they just needed to do a better job of explaining, has been upheld. So I think that's all I've got for the commission for today.
There was just one item on the written report I wanted to ask about. It was a short portion of the report, something that 401 CERT on the Rogue River, and you know, it made reference to the recent application in the Upper Rogue for an operator. And then as noted here, that received quite a bit of public comments. And so that application was withdrawn. And so kind of in that context, then so jet boats operating on the Rogue, apparently rather than like excavating, but they use these prop wash or jet wash. I'm not familiar with that. If it's what it sounds like, I probably can guess. But to kind of what blow channels clear or move gravel bars. And so it sounds like the proposal here is for the Corps to just extend 404 to allow essentially the modification of the channel through these kind of jet propulsion moving of sand and gravel. Do I understand that incorrectly, or is there anything else to say about this?
So this practice has been going on for decades. And there's a lower, what I'll call a lower rogue operator, lower part of the river operator. There's a middle rogue operator. And this in the director's report is talking about the lower part of the river. And it is for the jet boat operators. It's also, it turns out, is the way that the is it Douglas or Josephine? At any rate, the county is the way the county sheriff also accesses. It's one of the ways the county sheriff gets access up to. I can't remember the name of it. It's a very small community along the road, this section of the road. So there is ongoing conversation between DEQ and the Corps about what to do. What happened was that the applicant and the Corps had what I'm going to characterize as some miscommunication that resulted in the expiration of the Corps' permit, which meant that the water quality certification from DEQ also expired. And so, and now it's so late in the year that it's very difficult as a process matter to figure out what to do. So everyone's trying to figure out what to do for this particular year. And then there is going to be a longer term conversation around this general practice of making openings in the gravel bars for jet boats, and is that something that should continue? And then further context, I talked about the water resource challenges across the country that are going on. In the road, this spring and summer are going to be historic, probably low flows because of the hydrology in the basin. And so it frankly isn't even clear whether, even if this historic practice were to occur, whether there's going to be sufficient water in the basin for that sort of operation to even continue much during the summer. So there you go. That's the situation, and DEQ is kind of a one player, but the main player is really the core and the core for this. So I don't know exactly what's going to happen. We're in conversation about it.
Okay. It'll be interesting to hear more as it moves forward, and especially if we have an expired water quality cert that we're going to have to deal with. I certainly hear your point about the boating use, and I do know that that's very, very popular, something people enjoy doing. At the same time, there's very, very real water quality concerns with these very low flow years, and for the fisheries in these rivers, the slow flow years are going to be extremely hot, dangerous years for our resources, and I don't know the issues of the boat use and how that exacerbates issues of siltation and sedimentation. I don't know, I'm not read up on, but they seem like they should be very real concerns, and especially in those height crisis atmosphere years when you're going to have really hot water, you're going to have restricted access to off-channel refugia and things like that. So it would be interesting to hear more as we move forward.
I will just say, Chair George, that the federal fisheries services also are part of this conversation. And, obviously, their input's going to be pretty important on this also.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments on the director's report? Commissioner Kyle.
It's the river bend situation, because it always kind of comes up in public comment, and I want to understand the connection of the dots here, because it's saying that they're applying for the renewal for the landfill closure. And then the final closure means that they're no longer accepting waste and closure construction. But then in another sentence, it's there's not major differences between an active operating permit and a closure permit. So I'm confused.
And Commissioner Kyle, I'm sorry, this is some of the, I'll call it special language in the landfill regulation universe. So as I understand it, all of these major landfill operators are required to have, as part of their permit, a closure plan. So that in the event they close, it's kind of laid out how they're going to close. And after landfills close, there's a whole post-closure period where they're still regulated, even if they're not taking waste for landfill gas in particular, but also runoff, potential runoff. And there's still environmental concerns with the landfill even after it's stopped taking place. So your rules provide that when a large landfill gets within 8 years of closure, that it's required to then have a more detailed formal closure permit that specifies from 8 years out to when it actually closes what needs to occur to be ready for closure. That's what's going on right now. They are now on the path toward actual closure in 8 years, and that's the regulatory work that's going on. So what I said earlier, which probably confused things, is they could still come to DEQ and say, you know what, we want to expand this landfill and add another cell to take more waste. We can't prevent that if it, there's a land use question associated with that, and then there's an environmental permitting question. But for now, based on the permit that they currently have and currently in use, we are putting them on the clock for closure of 8 years.
But they can continue to accept waste
They
during
can.
that 8-year period
They can, but,
until it gets closed and then it's.
but they accept waste in a framework that has them ready to be closed if it comes back. I hope that clears it up a little bit. I didn't decide the system.
Dimension. That helps, yeah, because
I was confused by the language too.
the lawyers
Closing,
on with
but they
me on
can
this.
still.
Oh, you would have loved the previous chapter.
Yeah.
So this is gonna continue to be an issue then, because it still is an 8-year period, so.
It may, I mean, there are certain, I would assume we may still get complaints about the landfill during that period, and, you know, we're just signaling we can't control what the operator may apply for. They might try again to expand the landfill.
But currently, it's kind of on an 8-year.
Yep.
Down cycle.
If they expanded it, wouldn't it make their closure more difficult and then their post-closure obligations more stringent?
Commissioner, I don't know. I think it would depend on specific facts of what the expansion were and how it related to the existing operation.
All right.
No,
Any other
it's a
questions?
tricky little.
No
tricky one.
kidding, right? I mean, yeah. We will be hearing about Riverbend for a few more years at least. All right, any other questions or comments? Hearing none, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Motion's made and seconded. Anybody would like to stay here and not adjourn, please speak now. No, all right, we are now adjourned at 1:09 PM. I want to thank everybody who put a lot of work into making this a good meeting for everyone. And once again, we want to remember and thank all our DEQ employees and public servants. Thanks, everyone. It's been a good meeting.